It was the winter of 1941, and the world watched as Hitler's armies, unstoppable until then, stood at the very doorstep of Moscow, believing victory was within their grasp. The German war machine, which had swept across Europe with lightning speed, now faced its greatest challenge against the frozen earth, endless snow, and the unyielding resistance of the Soviet people. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history, had promised quick triumph, but by December it devolved into a desperate struggle of men, machines, and endurance. In the streets of Moscow, civilians dug trenches, built barricades, and prepared to defend their city to the last breath. In the forests and fields surrounding the capital, Red Army divisions, battered yet unbroken, gathered for one final stand. Temperatures plunged to -40, weapons froze in soldiers' hands, and frostbite claimed as many lives as bullets. Yet amid the suffering, the Soviets launched a counteroffensive that would shatter Hitler's dream of conquering the East in a single campaign. This was not just a battle for a city, it was a battle for survival, for the future of a nation, and for the direction of the entire war. Tonight, as you listen, you will step into the frozen trenches, hear the thunder of artillery across snow-bound plains, and witness how ordinary soldiers endured extraordinary hardship. And as always, I invite you to settle in, get comfortable, and let this story unfold. Leave a comment to tell me where in the world you are tuning in from, and what time it is as you join us on this journey into history. On June 22nd, 1941, as dawn broke across the vast expanse of Eastern Europe, the earth itself seemed to tremble with the roar of engines. 3 million German soldiers surged forward in the largest invasion force the world had ever seen, their columns stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Operation Barbarossa was Hitler's grand gamble, the lightning strike that he believed would shatter the Soviet Union in a matter of months. Tanks, trucks, artillery, and aircraft rolled eastward in endless convoys, their movement orchestrated with chilling precision. The Luftwaffe swept into the skies, striking Soviet airfields before many planes could leave the ground. Within hours, thousands of Soviet aircraft were destroyed on runways, their wreckage smoking in the morning light. German officers believed they were witnessing the prelude to an easy conquest, the opening act of a campaign that would rival Caesar's march on Gaul. Hitler himself described the campaign as a clash of civilizations, a war of annihilation meant to destroy Bolshevism forever. For the soldiers on the ground, it was a war that promised glory and conquest. But for the millions in its path, it was the beginning of unimaginable suffering. The German strategy relied on blitzkrieg, lightning war, a doctrine perfected in Poland and France. Massed armor spearheaded the attack, slicing through enemy lines with speed and shock. Behind them came mechanized infantry, sealing off pockets of resistance and capturing vast numbers of prisoners. The Luftwaffe provided close air support, strafing roads, destroying columns, and isolating Soviet units from one another. It was a war designed not for steady advance, but for sudden collapse, overwhelming the enemy before they could organize. In the opening days, the plan worked with terrifying efficiency. Soviet border armies were encircled and destroyed, their command structures shattered by the speed of German thrusts. Entire divisions vanished in weeks, their men captured, killed, or dispersed in chaotic retreats. German generals boasted that they had already broken the backbone of Soviet resistance, and for a time it seemed as though nothing could halt the advancing tide. The Soviet Union, caught off guard, reeled under the weight of the onslaught. Stalin had ignored numerous warnings of invasion, convinced that Hitler would not risk a two-front war. On the morning of June 22nd, he retreated into shock and silence, unable to comprehend the scale of the betrayal. Soviet units at the frontier found themselves outmatched in every category. tanks outdated, aircraft obsolete, communications unreliable. The Red Army was still reeling from Stalin's purges of the 1930s, which had decimated its officer corps and left it riddled with inexperience. Commanders hesitated, uncertain whether to retreat, counterattack, or simply hold their ground. Orders were contradictory, sometimes suicidal, demanding impossible stands that led to massacre. German mechanized columns exploited every hesitation, cutting through defenses like blades through paper. Cities such as Minsk fell within days, their defenders overwhelmed and their populations thrown into chaos. For the Soviets, the summer of 1941 became a season of catastrophe. Yet, even amid collapse, the vastness of the Soviet Union and the resilience of its people began to shape the struggle. German divisions advanced hundreds of miles, but each step stretched their supply lines further into the interior. Railroads had to be converted to German gauge, trucks wore out on primitive roads, and fuel became harder to deliver. Soviet industry, meanwhile, began the monumental task of dismantling entire factories and moving them east of the Urals. Workers labored night and day to reassemble plants in Siberia, ensuring that production would continue far from the reach of German bombers. Civilians dug defenses, built trenches, and prepared for a war that seemed apocalyptic in scale. Refugees flooded eastward, their carts clogging roads already jammed with retreating soldiers. For every Soviet soldier captured, another was mobilized, another rifle handed out, another line of defense prepared. Stalin's empire was staggering, but it was not yet broken, and the Germans were beginning to realize that victory would not come as quickly as they had dreamed. The opening phase of Barbarossa was marked by massive encirclement battles that dwarfed anything seen in Western Europe. At Bialystok and Minsk, over 300,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped and captured in vast pockets. At Smolensk, another 500,000 men were encircled in a battle that raged for weeks, slowing the German advance but costing the Soviets dearly. Prisoner columns stretched for miles, ragged men marching east to captivity under the watch of German guards. German propaganda filmed the scenes as proof of unstoppable conquest, presenting the war as already won. But behind the victories lay grim realities. Each encirclement cost time, resources, and lives, while the Red Army continually regenerated. Unlike France, the Soviet Union was not a small state that collapsed with the loss of its capital. It was a continent-sized nation with depth, manpower, and willpower that defied imagination. And the deeper the Germans advanced, the more resistance they would face. What seemed like triumph was already becoming a test of endurance. The brutality of Barbarossa went beyond military strategy. It was a war of ideology and annihilation. Hitler had ordered that the war in the East be fought without mercy, with commissars executed and entire populations enslaved. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, followed behind the front, murdering Jews, intellectuals, and suspected partisans in mass shootings. Villages were burned, civilians executed, and entire communities erased from existence. For German soldiers, the war blurred lines between battlefield and atrocity, between military duty and ideological violence. For Soviet civilians, it was a nightmare of occupation, starvation, and terror. Farmers watched their harvests seized, their homes destroyed, their families driven into the open. Refugees flooded further east, spreading stories of horror that stiffened Soviet resolve. The war had become not merely about territory, but survival itself. And in such a war, the Soviet Union found a grim strength. As July turned to August, the German advance slowed. But it did not stop. Army Group North pressed toward Leningrad. Army Group South captured Ukraine, and Army Group Center drove relentlessly toward Moscow. The capital became the ultimate prize. the symbol of Soviet resistance and the heart of its communications network. Hitler was convinced that taking Moscow would collapse Stalin's regime and bring the war to a swift end. German divisions pressed forward, seizing Smolensk and preparing for the next phase of the offensive. Yet each gain came with mounting costs, fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and growing Soviet counterattacks. Zhukov and other commanders began organizing defenses, buying time with every delaying action. The German timetable, so precise on paper, was slipping away with each passing week, and the gates of Moscow, though threatened, still stood closed. Operation Barbarossa had promised lightning victory, but by late summer 1941, cracks were already showing. The Soviets had lost millions of men, yet their armies remained in the field, reinforced by new conscripts and fresh equipment from relocated factories. German soldiers, hardened veterans of earlier campaigns, now faced a war without end, stretching into the vastness of Russia's plains. The dream of reaching Moscow before the first snows seemed possible, but only just. Supplies ran thin, exhaustion grew, and commanders argued over strategy. The road to Moscow was open, but it was long, brutal, and unforgiving. What began as blitzkrieg was becoming a war of attrition, one the Germans had never planned for. Barbarossa had set the stage for the greatest battle of the war, a struggle not just for a city but for the fate of Europe. The summer of triumph was fading into the autumn of doubt, and ahead lay the crucible of Moscow, where Hitler's gamble would be tested at last. The opening weeks of Barbarossa had thrown the Soviet Union into chaos, and in Moscow, panic spread like wildfire. Rumors of German tanks advancing unchecked fueled despair, while stories of entire Soviet armies captured in encirclements filled the capital with dread. Railway stations became scenes of desperation, with families pushing to board trains that promised safety in the east. Government ministries began hurriedly evacuating, their records packed into crates and their staff fleeing the city. Even parts of the state treasury, including priceless icons and artworks, were crated up for removal beyond the Urals. For many Muscovites, it felt as if the city was being abandoned to its fate. Crowds whispered that the government had already fled, that Stalin himself had left Moscow in secrecy. Fear spread faster than orders, and confidence in survival seemed to evaporate with each passing day. In those weeks, the collapse of morale threatened to accomplish what German armies could not. The Soviet capital stood at the brink of despair. In this atmosphere of fear, Stalin retreated into silence during the first days of the invasion, shocked by the magnitude of the disaster. Yet by July his resolve began to harden, and with it came the decision that Moscow could not and would not be abandoned. Advisors urged him to evacuate, pointing to the rapid German advance and the example of governments fleeing their capitals in previous wars. But Stalin refused, insisting that if Moscow fell, the Soviet Union itself would collapse. He made a deliberate choice to stay in the Kremlin, a symbolic act of defiance that carried enormous weight. From the fortress at the heart of the capital, he declared that the city would be defended to the last. The order went out: no retreat, no surrender, no more withdrawals without permission from the highest command. Soviet officers understood that disobedience would mean execution, yet the clarity of the command restored discipline. For soldiers and civilians alike, Stalin's refusal to leave Moscow became a rallying point. The capital was to be transformed into a fortress. The evacuation of Moscow did not stop entirely, but it was redirected with ruthless precision. Factories vital to the war effort were dismantled and moved eastward by rail, part of the colossal relocation program already underway. Thousands of engineers, workers, and managers boarded trains with machinery, tools, and blueprints, leaving behind empty shells of industrial plants. Meanwhile, ordinary civilians were ordered to dig anti-tank ditches, construct barricades, and prepare defenses within the city itself. Parks and boulevards were torn open to create trenches, while tram lines were ripped up to block the movement of enemy armor. Children carried stones for fortifications, while elderly women filled sandbags in endless rows. Even the Moscow metro, a symbol of Soviet modernity, was converted into a bomb shelter and a command post. The city itself was being reshaped, its beauty sacrificed to survival. The evacuation was no longer about flight, it was about transformation. Moscow was being prepared not as a city of retreat, but as a city of resistance. As the German advance pressed deeper into Soviet territory, Stalin issued one of the most draconian orders of the entire war. Order No. 227, later known by its haunting phrase, "Not one step back." Though formally issued in 1942, the roots of this command were already planted in the grim summer and autumn of 1941. Units that attempted unauthorized retreat were threatened with execution, while blocking detachments of NKVD troops were stationed behind the lines to enforce discipline. Fear of the Germans was matched by fear of one's own state, ensuring that soldiers fought not only for survival, but against the consequences of disobedience. Yet beneath the terror, there was also steel. The message was clear that the Soviet Union would fight to the last. This brutal determination instilled resolve among troops who otherwise might have broken under the pressure. Stalin understood that his people had to believe retreat was impossible. It was a harsh, uncompromising strategy, but in those desperate days it prevented collapse. The Red Army would hold, or it would die where it stood. On November 7th, 1941, the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, Stalin staged a parade in Red Square, even as German armies closed within sight of the capital. Snow fell lightly as Soviet soldiers marched past Lenin's mausoleum, their boots striking the cobblestones in rhythmic defiance. Tanks rolled through the square, their tracks rattling as they headed directly from the parade toward the front lines. Stalin stood above them, addressing the troops with a speech broadcast across the nation. He invoked the memory of Russia's past struggles against Napoleon, against foreign invaders who had once reached Moscow's gates and been destroyed. His voice, calm but firm, promised that this war too would end in Soviet victory. Civilians listening on radios in basements wept with pride, their despair replaced with renewed faith. Soldiers marching through the square carried his words into battle, their morale transformed by the spectacle. The parade was no mere ceremony, it was a weapon of spirit, and in those dark hours, it mattered as much as guns and tanks. While Stalin stayed in Moscow, he relied on trusted commanders to execute the defense. Georgy Zhukov, newly appointed to lead the city's defenses, brought ruthless energy and clarity to the task. He reorganized battered units, consolidated reserves, and imposed discipline with uncompromising authority. Under his direction, defensive belts were established west of the city, reinforced with mines, barbed wire, and artillery emplacements. The entire population of Moscow became part of his army, laboring day and night to create the lines of resistance. At the same time, NKVD troops patrolled the streets, ensuring order and preventing desertion. Stalin demanded daily reports, often intervening directly in military decisions, yet he trusted Zhukov's instincts when it came to the battlefield. The partnership between the paranoid dictator and the iron-willed general became the cornerstone of Moscow's defense. For the first time in months, the Soviet capital felt guarded by more than hope. It was shielded by steel, discipline, and unshakable resolve. Despite the visible preparations, life in Moscow remained a study in contrasts. By day the city worked feverishly, its streets filled with laborers and soldiers. By night, blackout curtains plunged entire districts into darkness, broken only by the searchlights scanning the skies. German bombers raided the city repeatedly, their bombs falling on factories, residential districts, and rail lines. Civilians huddled in the metro, listening to the distant thunder of explosions as dust fell from the ceilings. Fire brigades worked tirelessly to contain blazes, often with little more than buckets and determination. Food grew scarce, with rations cut and lines stretching for hours at bakeries. Rumors spread constantly of betrayal, of spies, of German tanks already at the gates. Yet amid the fear, a grim pride emerged, a sense that Moscow's survival would decide the fate of the war. For every Muscovite, endurance became a form of resistance, and their city became the heart of a nation refusing to surrender. Stalin's decision to remain in Moscow was more than symbolic. It became the pivot upon which the Soviet war effort turned. His presence reassured allies and terrified subordinates, while his refusal to leave steadied a nation teetering on collapse. The capital was not evacuated, not surrendered, not abandoned, but armed and fortified like a besieged citadel. Every speech, every order, every gesture from Stalin reinforced the message: Moscow would not fall. The German army might batter at its gates, but the city would endure. This defiance shaped the Soviet psyche, transforming fear into determination, despair into resistance. The world watched as Moscow prepared to face annihilation, and in that preparation, Stalin found his greatest weapon: resolve. For the Germans, the expectation of a quick victory was already unraveling, and for the Soviets, the will to fight was now bound inseparably to the defense of their capital. The battle for Moscow had yet to reach its climax, but its spirit had already been forged in fire. At the heart of Operation Barbarossa's grand design stood Army Group Center, the most powerful striking force ever assembled by the Wehrmacht. Commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, a seasoned Prussian officer of aristocratic bearing. Its mission was clear: drive through the center of the Soviet Union and seize Moscow. Von Bock had under his command nearly 50 divisions, including 9 panzer divisions and 6 motorized infantry divisions, supported by over 2,000 aircraft of the Luftwaffe's Second Air Fleet. The Spearhead was led by 2 armored Titans, Panzer Group 2 under Heinz Guderian and Panzer Group 3 under Hermann Hoth. These were the cutting edges of blitzkrieg, designed to move fast, encircle, and annihilate. Behind them, the infantry armies, 4th under von Kluge and 9th under Strauss, marched on foot, tasked with mopping up and consolidating gains. The scale was staggering, a mechanized juggernaut stretching hundreds of miles across roads, railways, and open fields. German officers believed they commanded an unstoppable force, a weapon that had already humbled France in mere weeks. But in Russia, the challenge ahead was unlike anything they had ever faced. For in the east lay not just armies, but a continent. At the tip of this juggernaut was Heinz Guderian, the father of blitzkrieg, whose name had become synonymous with armored warfare. A restless innovator, Guderian had written the book on modern tank tactics, and now he commanded Panzer Group 2 with over 600 tanks. His divisions included the battle-hardened 3rd, 4th, and 10th Panzer Divisions, each supported by mechanized infantry and artillery. To Guderian, speed was everything. His mantra was Klotzen, nicht klecken, hit hard, not piddling about. He envisioned sweeping movements that bypassed strong points, collapsing the Soviet front in a cascade of encirclements. Hermann Hoth, commanding Panzer Group 3 to the north, was equally determined. His force of more than 700 tanks spearheaded the northern thrust, linking with Guderian in pincer movements that trapped Soviet armies by the hundreds of thousands. Both men clashed with von Buck over how aggressively to push, but they shared his vision of Moscow as the ultimate goal. Theirs was a partnership of ambition, rivalry, and tactical brilliance. Together, they were the twin blades of Army Group Center's advance. The drive began with thunderous momentum as German armored columns poured into Belarus. Soviet frontier defenses, already fragile, crumbled beneath the speed and ferocity of the assault. Luftwaffe bombers struck airfields, rail junctions, and troop concentrations, paralyzing Soviet attempts to coordinate. In the forests and marshes of western Russia, German tanks roared down dusty roads, their columns stretching for miles. Infantry followed in horse-drawn wagons, a reminder of the Wehrmacht's strange mix of modernity and tradition. Within days, German spearheads converged near Bialystok and Minsk, encircling the Soviet Western Front. The trap closed on 4 entire Soviet armies, cutting off more than 300,000 men. Prisoner columns stretched across the horizon, dazed soldiers trudging east as their commanders vanished into captivity. The scale of the disaster stunned the Soviets and exhilarated the Germans. It seemed as if Moscow might be theirs by the end of summer. But the Soviet Union was not France, and victory did not come with a single decisive blow. At Smolensk, the Germans encountered one of the first true tests of Soviet resilience. Here in July 1941, the Soviets mounted counterattacks that slowed the momentum of the German advance. The Red Army, though battered and poorly coordinated, fought with stubborn determination. Marshal Timoshenko and General Zhukov rushed reinforcements into the sector, forcing Guderian and Hoth to commit their armored groups in prolonged fighting. For weeks the battle raged across forests, fields, and villages, leaving both sides exhausted. The Germans ultimately encircled another 300,000 Soviet troops, capturing the ancient city of Smolensk in the process. Yet the price was time, and in a campaign built on speed, time was a weapon the Soviets could not afford to surrender. The delay gave Stalin precious weeks to strengthen Moscow's defenses. Smolensk was a German victory, but it was also the first shadow of doubt. Von Bock's Army Group Center pressed on relentlessly, but cracks began to show beneath the surface of triumph. German logistics, already stretched by the vast distances, struggled to keep up with the advance. Supply convoys bogged down on primitive roads, where dust in summer and mud in autumn made movement a nightmare. Tanks and trucks broke down from overuse, their spare parts dwindling. Fuel became a constant obsession, with panzer commanders forced to halt while waiting for gasoline. Horses, still the backbone of German logistics, collapsed under the strain of hauling artillery and supplies. The Luftwaffe, dominant in the skies, found its range limited by forward airfields that could not move quickly enough. Meanwhile, Soviet forces, though repeatedly encircled, continued to reform new lines farther east. It was like fighting an enemy with endless depth, one that could lose armies and yet return with more. The Germans had won spectacular battles, but Moscow still loomed far on the horizon. The terrain itself conspired against the invaders, turning each advance into an ordeal. The endless forests of Belarus swallowed entire columns, where narrow tracks funneled tanks into ambushes. Marshlands stretched for miles, forcing German armor onto limited causeways, vulnerable to Soviet fire. Bridges collapsed under the weight of heavy equipment, delaying advances and stranding units. Villages became strongpoints, defended by Soviet troops who fought with desperation, often until annihilation. German soldiers, accustomed to the rolling fields of France, were unprepared for the sheer scale of the Russian landscape. Heat baked the plains in July, dust choking men and machines alike. At night the land turned cold, sapping strength from exhausted infantry. Every mile gained seemed to demand a toll of fuel, blood, and time. Yet still, Von Buch urged his armies forward, convinced that Moscow could be reached before winter. The road ahead was long, but the prize seemed close enough to touch. Inside the German command, debates simmered over the pace and direction of the advance. Von Bock argued passionately for a direct thrust at Moscow, believing that the capture of the Soviet capital would end the war. Guderian, ever aggressive, supported this view, demanding permission to push forward without delay. Hitler, however, grew increasingly fixated on flanking objectives, Ukraine in the south and Leningrad in the north. The Führer believed that raw resources and symbolic victories mattered more than a single city, even Moscow. This divergence in strategy sowed frustration among German commanders, who watched their momentum squandered in diversions. Von Bock pleaded for unity of purpose, but his authority was undermined by Hitler's constant interference. The Wehrmacht's greatest strength, its speed, was being bled away by hesitation and conflicting orders. Time, once the Germans' greatest ally, now began to favor the Soviets, and Moscow, though still threatened, gained a reprieve. By the end of August 1941, Army Group Center had advanced hundreds of miles, destroyed entire Soviet armies, and stood on the threshold of triumph. Yet its victories carried the seeds of its future defeat. Each encirclement battle drained energy, delayed progress, and stretched supply lines ever thinner. The Red Army, though shattered, had not collapsed, and its reserves were being drawn deeper into the fight. Moscow remained the glittering prize, but it was still far beyond the grasp of exhausted divisions. Von Bock's men, who had begun the campaign believing they would march in victory parades by autumn, now found themselves locked in a war of attrition. The panzers that had once raced across Europe were grinding down in the dust and mud of Russia. Guderian and Hoth, frustrated but determined, prepared for the next push eastward. Smolensk marked both triumph and warning, a victory that hinted at limits the Germans did not wish to see. Ahead lay the fateful choices that would shape the entire campaign, and the road to Moscow stretched ever longer, ever bloodier. By mid-July 1941, German forces had carved deep into the Soviet heartland, their panzers sweeping eastward with terrifying speed. Minsk had already fallen, hundreds of thousands of prisoners had been captured, and Army Group Center appeared unstoppable. Yet as the Wehrmacht advanced on Smolensk, it encountered resistance unlike anything seen in the West. Soviet forces, battered and disorganized, nonetheless regrouped along the Dnieper River, determined to slow the German tide. The city of Smolensk, with its ancient walls and crossroads position, became a critical stronghold. Here Soviet commanders sought not just to defend, but to strike back with counterattacks. The Germans expected another swift encirclement, another collapsing Soviet front. Instead, they faced waves of counterblows that blunted momentum and forced costly battles of attrition. The trap at Smolensk did not ensnare the Germans, but it ensnared their timetable, and in a war built on speed, delay was deadly. The defense was orchestrated by Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, a veteran commander entrusted with restoring order. Under him, the remnants of several Soviet armies were cobbled together into a fragile defensive line. Fresh recruits marched to the front with little training, many armed with outdated rifles or even shovels pressed into service as weapons. Tanks like the T-26 and BT-7, relics of the 1930s, rattled into battle against modern Panzer IICs and IVs. Yet alongside them appeared the first of the new T-34 Send, KV-1 Sends, machines that shocked German crews with their armor and firepower. The Soviets threw everything they had into the fight, often committing units piecemeal as soon as they arrived. Entire divisions were swallowed in days, but their sacrifice bought time. Every field, every forest, every village became a battlefield where men fought to the death. Timoshenko understood he could not stop the Germans outright, but he could bleed them, and in that bleeding lay survival. It was during the fighting at Smolensk that Georgy Zhukov, then chief of the general staff, began to assert himself as a decisive voice. Zhukov had already argued bitterly with Stalin in June, warning against reckless counterattacks that risked annihilation. But at Smolensk, his skill in coordination began to show as he directed counteroffensives that kept German commanders off balance. Soviet forces struck at German flanks, forcing the panzers to turn back and deal with threats in their rear. Encirclements that should have collapsed swiftly dragged on for weeks, costing the Germans fuel, ammunition, and men. Zhukov's interventions impressed Stalin, who was beginning to see in him the kind of iron-willed commander the Red Army desperately needed. Though the Soviets lost vast numbers of men, the battle forced the Germans into their first prolonged struggle in the east. For Zhukov, Smolensk was a crucible that tested his leadership under fire, and it marked the beginning of his rise as the Soviet Union's most formidable wartime general. The battle unfolded not as a single clash, but as a grinding series of encirclements and breakouts. German armored pincers encircled Soviet armies west of Smolensk, trapping more than 300,000 men. Yet, unlike earlier battles, many Soviet units refused to surrender, launching breakout attempts that tied down German divisions. Fighting raged in forests and swamps, where partisans and remnants of shattered units ambushed convoys and supply lines. German officers complained that what should have been swift mopping-up operations turned into brutal house-to-house and tree-to-tree combat. Soviet soldiers, often surrounded and cut off, fought until their ammunition was gone, then charged with bayonets. Some units dissolved into the countryside, re-emerging as guerrilla fighters behind German lines. The Wehrmacht was still advancing, but it was bleeding in ways it had not anticipated. The encirclements no longer yielded easy victories, they yielded prolonged resistance, and every delay chipped away at the illusion of invincibility. The Luftwaffe, too, faced unexpected challenges in the skies over Smolensk. At the start of Barbarossa, it had destroyed thousands of Soviet planes on the ground, achieving overwhelming air superiority, but new Soviet aircraft, including the Yak-1 and MiG-3, began appearing in greater numbers, flown by pilots determined to defend their homeland. Though often outnumbered and less experienced, these airmen launched daring attacks against German bombers and supply planes. Soviet flak batteries, hastily redeployed around Smolensk, added to the attrition. German losses were still lighter than those of their opponents, but for the first time they were mounting noticeably. Supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles, meant that damaged aircraft and worn engines were harder to replace. Fuel shortages further limited operations, reducing the Luftwaffe's ability to dominate. For the soldiers on the ground, this meant fewer Stuka dives to shatter Soviet defenses, and it allowed the Red Army breathing room to regroup. Conditions for soldiers were harsh beyond imagination. The summer heat baked the steppe, turning dust into choking clouds that coated men and machines. Water was scarce, and both armies relied on wells and rivers that quickly became fouled by corpses and debris. Disease spread through the ranks, weakening already exhausted soldiers. German troops, accustomed to quick campaigns, were shocked at the ferocity of Soviet resistance and the vastness of the battlefield. Soviet troops, often undersupplied, endured hunger, thirst, and exhaustion as constants of survival. Villagers caught in the middle saw their homes burned, their fields trampled, and their families torn apart by advancing and retreating armies. Yet through it all, the Soviets refused to yield completely, drawing strength from sheer desperation. For German soldiers, Smolensk was the first time they realized the enemy would not collapse like France or Poland. For Soviet soldiers, it was the first proof that resistance could slow the invincible Wehrmacht, and in that realization lay the seeds of future victories. As the battle dragged into August, German commanders grew frustrated with the time and resources consumed at Smolensk. Von Bock pushed for a direct drive to Moscow, believing that every day lost was fatal to Barbarossa's timetable. Guderian argued the same, desperate to unleash his panzers eastward, but Hitler overruled them, redirecting armoured forces south to encircle Kiev, a decision that would delay the Moscow offensive by critical weeks. The diversion infuriated frontline generals, who knew that momentum was the lifeblood of blitzkrieg. Meanwhile, the Soviets used the respite to dig deeper defensive lines, mobilize more reserves, and relocate more factories. Smolensk had bought them time, and time was their greatest ally. German officers wrote in their diaries of exhaustion, of endless fighting without decisive results. The myth of blitzkrieg's unstoppable momentum was cracking, and Smolensk was the hammer blow that made the fracture visible. In the end, Smolensk fell, and Soviet casualties were catastrophic, hundreds of thousands killed, wounded, or captured. Yet the Germans had paid a price that went beyond numbers. They had lost the element of time, the rhythm of lightning war, and the certainty of victory. For the first time they had encountered a Soviet defense that did not simply collapse but fought back with dogged resilience. The Red Army, though battered, proved it could absorb staggering losses and still fight on. Smolensk was not a Soviet victory in the traditional sense, but it was a turning point of endurance. It revealed that the war in the East would not be short, and it would not be easy. German soldiers who once dreamed of parading through Moscow now marched into uncertainty. The road to Moscow was still open, but it was no longer clear, and Smolensk had shown that even the mightiest spearhead could be blunted. By August 1941, the Wehrmacht had stormed hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, yet the campaign's central prize, Moscow, remained out of reach. Field Marshal von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, urged an immediate thrust toward the Soviet capital before the autumn rains arrived. His armored spearheads, though battered, still retained the power to break through to Moscow if unleashed quickly. Guderian and Hoth pressed the same case, insisting that speed was everything and that hesitation would squander their advantage. Yet Hitler saw the war not through the eyes of his generals, but through the lens of ideology and resources. He fixated on the fertile lands of Ukraine and the symbolic city of Leningrad, believing their capture mattered more than Moscow. He argued that Ukraine's grain and coal would sustain the Reich, while Leningrad's fall would cripple Soviet morale and industry. Against the advice of his generals, he ordered the panzers of Army Group Center to turn north and south. It was a decision that fractured momentum at the decisive moment, and in that fracture lay the seeds of failure. The southern diversion was entrusted to Heinz Guderian, and his Panzer Group 2 redirected toward Ukraine. His orders were to link with Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, to encircle the Soviet forces defending Kiev. Kiev, the ancient capital of Ukraine, was both a strategic hub and a symbolic city of immense value. The Soviets had concentrated massive forces there, believing it to be the key to holding their southern flank. Stalin, stubborn and unyielding, refused to authorize withdrawal despite warnings of encirclement. The Red Army stood its ground, convinced that reinforcements and counterattacks could save the position. German intelligence identified the opportunity for the largest encirclement in history, and Hitler seized it eagerly. Guderian's panzers swung south, linking with Panzer Group 1 under Ewald von Kleist in a colossal pincer. The jaws of the trap began to close, and within its maw, the Soviet southwest front was about to be swallowed whole. The Battle of Kiev unfolded on a scale that defied comprehension. Over 600,000 Soviet soldiers found themselves encircled as German armor cut off every avenue of retreat. Entire Soviet armies, 15 divisions strong, were trapped in the tightening ring. German artillery and aircraft hammered the pocket relentlessly, while infantry closed in to finish the destruction. Soviet soldiers fought desperately, but supplies of food, fuel, and ammunition collapsed within days. Columns of prisoners stretched for miles as the Germans captured men faster than they could be processed. The scale of the encirclement dwarfed anything seen before in the war, surpassing even the earlier battles of Minsk and Smolensk. German propaganda celebrated it as the greatest triumph of blitzkrieg, proof of Hitler's genius. But for every soldier captured, Soviet resolve only hardened, and more recruits were rushed from the interior. The battlefield at Kiev was a graveyard of armies, but also a graveyard of time. The numbers from Kiev staggered even hardened German officers. Nearly 700,000 Soviet prisoners were taken, along with thousands of tanks, guns, and vehicles. The Red Army's southwestern front had been annihilated, its commanders either dead, captured, or fleeing in disarray. German divisions reveled in the scale of their victory, convinced they had shattered Soviet resistance for good. Hitler hailed it as the greatest battle in history, boasting that the Soviet Union was finished. Yet beneath the triumph lay exhaustion. Panzers that had marched hundreds of miles were worn thin, their engines strained and their crews exhausted. Supply lines stretched impossibly long, forced to support operations across two massive theaters simultaneously. The destruction at Kiev came at the price of weeks of delay, weeks that Moscow used to prepare. And in the calculus of war, time often outweighs numbers. Kiev was a masterpiece of encirclement, but it was also a masterpiece of squandered opportunity. While Guderian drove south, Hermann Hoth's Panzer Group 3 and elements of Army Group North turned their focus northward. Their target was Leningrad, the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution, and a city Hitler had vowed to erase from the map. German forces pressed through the Baltic states, linking with Finnish armies advancing from the north. The siege of Leningrad began in September, trapping millions of civilians inside the city. Hitler's orders were merciless. The city was not to be taken but starved, its population left to die. German artillery shelled factories and homes, while Luftwaffe bombers rained destruction from above. Yet Leningrad did not fall. It endured under a siege that would last nearly 900 days. For Army Group Center, the diversion north meant that armored divisions critical to the Moscow offensive were tied up in another theater, and as weeks slipped by, the dream of reaching Moscow before winter faded further. The city on the Neva resisted, and its resistance bled the German timetable. Within the German High Command, frustration boiled over. Von Bock argued bitterly with Berlin, pleading that Moscow was the decisive objective and that diversions were draining his strength. Guderian himself clashed with Hitler in tense meetings, warning that the Moscow offensive risked collapse if delayed further. Yet Hitler remained adamant, convinced that his vision was superior to his general's operational instincts. The Führer believed that by destroying Soviet forces in the flanks, the path to Moscow would be safer and easier. But the Wehrmacht's strength lay in its speed, in keeping the enemy off balance. Every diversion undermined that principle, giving the Soviets time to regroup and prepare. The German advance slowed to a crawl, while Soviet morale, though battered, was not broken. The delay allowed Stalin to bring in reinforcements from Siberia, factories from the Urals, and fresh defenses around Moscow. Hitler believed he had secured triumphs at Kiev and Leningrad, In truth, he had squandered the chance for a swift victory. The Soviets, though devastated by Kiev, seized the respite to transform Moscow into a fortress. Civilians dug trenches, laid mines, and constructed barricades across the approaches to the city. Entire industries relocated eastward began producing tanks, guns, and ammunition at astonishing speed. The Red Army, though mauled, rebuilt itself in the shadow of the capital. Stalin drew upon new recruits, reserves, and Siberian divisions now released from guarding the Far East. The time bought by Hitler's diversions was measured not in days but in divisions, in tanks, and in lives prepared to defend Moscow. The German generals understood this bitter truth, even as their leader celebrated hollow victories. For them, the diversion meant fighting winter in Russia, a fate they dreaded. The Wehrmacht had gained territory, but it had lost momentum, and in the vastness of Russia, momentum was the difference between victory and catastrophe. The diversions to Kiev and Leningrad stand as one of the most fateful decisions of the Second World War. In pursuit of symbolic and resource-driven goals, Hitler robbed his generals of the chance to seize Moscow at the critical moment. Kiev yielded a colossal victory on paper, yet it drained weeks of time and strength that could never be regained. Leningrad was besieged, but not captured, tying down forces in a brutal campaign that consumed vast resources. The Moscow offensive, delayed until October, would now be launched in the teeth of autumn rains and the coming winter. What might have been a swift conquest became a grinding war of attrition. The Wehrmacht had shown brilliance in execution, but blindness in strategy. Hitler believed he was shaping destiny with his diversions. In reality, he was condemning his armies to fight a campaign they could not win, and the road to Moscow grew colder, longer, and far more lethal. By late September 1941, with the victories at Kiev and Smolensk behind them, the Germans turned once more toward their ultimate objective, Moscow. Hitler declared that the Soviet capital was the heart of the Bolshevik beast, and that its fall would shatter the enemy's will to resist. The offensive was given a dramatic name, Operation Typhoon, a storm meant to sweep away the Red Army in one final decisive strike. German propaganda hailed it as the last act of Barbarossa, promising soldiers that victory was weeks away. Field Marshal von Bock's Army Group Center prepared to unleash its full might, reorganized and reinforced for the decisive push. Panzer Group 2 under Guderian swung north from Ukraine, Panzer Group 3 under Hoth regrouped after Smolensk, and Panzer Group 4 under Hofner joined from the north. Together with the 4th and 9th Armies, they represented over 1.9 million men, supported by more than 1,000 tanks and 14,000 guns. The Luftwaffe prepared to commit 1,000 aircraft to blanket the skies over the battlefield. It was a concentration of force unparalleled in the campaign thus far, and it was aimed directly at the gates of Moscow. The German plan mirrored their earlier successes, relying on massive encirclements to destroy Soviet armies before storming the capital. North and south of Moscow, the panzer groups would form sweeping pincers, converging to trap Soviet forces defending the approaches. Once the Red Army was annihilated, infantry armies would march east, occupying the city itself. German planners believed the operation would take no more than a few weeks, bringing the war in the east to a victorious conclusion before winter set in. Confidence ran high, for the Wehrmacht had already destroyed more than 200 Soviet divisions in the summer campaign. Yet beneath the triumph lay exhaustion, vehicles worn thin, men battered by months of marching and fighting. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles back to Poland, vulnerable to weather and Soviet partisans. Still, Hitler assured his generals that the Soviets were on the verge of collapse. For him, Moscow was not only a military objective but a symbol, and symbols he believed were worth any gamble. Facing this storm was a Soviet army battered but unbroken. Stalin and the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, had assembled new defensive lines west of Moscow, manned by fresh conscripts and remnants of shattered divisions. These forces were under-equipped, often lacking rifles, helmets, or adequate training, but they were ordered to hold at all costs. Stalin's refusal to retreat meant that the Germans would not find empty roads but determined defenders. Behind them, the Soviet capital prepared itself like a besieged fortress, with trenches, bunkers, and barricades spreading for miles. Thousands of civilians labored in the mud and cold, carving defenses into the very soil of Russia. Factories relocated to the Urals began producing tanks and planes that trickled back into the fight. The Red Army was bleeding, but it was also regenerating at a pace the Germans did not fully grasp. For the defenders, Moscow was more than a city, it was the heart of their motherland, and they were prepared to fight for it until death. The opening blow of Operation Typhoon fell on October 2nd, 1941. German armor surged forward in massive spearheads, supported by artillery barrages and waves of Stuka dive bombers. At Bryansk and Vyazma, the pincers closed with devastating speed, trapping entire Soviet armies in vast encirclements. Within days, hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers found themselves surrounded, cut off from supplies and escape. German propaganda celebrated the victories, declaring that Moscow now lay open and defenseless. Yet the battles were not effortless. Soviet counterattacks and desperate breakouts tied down German divisions longer than anticipated. The Germans captured nearly 700,000 prisoners in the Twin Pockets, but their timetables slipped in the process. Each encirclement was another triumph of blitzkrieg tactics, but each also consumed precious time and resources. Winter crept closer, its shadow lengthening with every day lost, and in Russia the calendar could be as deadly as any army. As German armor pushed eastward, confidence soared among commanders and troops alike. They believed they were on the cusp of delivering the final blow, the strike that would topple the Soviet Union. Patrols reported they were only weeks from Moscow, with some advance units already glimpsing road signs pointing to the capital. Soldiers wrote home boasting that Christmas would be spent in victory celebrations. Yet reality was far harsher than expectation. Soviet resistance stiffened with every mile, forcing the Germans into costly clashes across rivers, forests, and fortified villages. Fuel shortages became acute, with tank units immobilized for days, while convoys struggled to reach the front. Rains turned roads into seas of mud, slowing the advance to a crawl and wearing out exhausted vehicles. Still, von Bock pushed his men forward, urging them to break the enemy before weather sealed the battlefield. The race to Moscow was underway, but the finish line was receding with every step. The psychological weight of Operation Typhoon bore heavily on both sides. For the Germans, the belief in imminent victory was a powerful motivator, but it also bred overconfidence. Commanders underestimated Soviet resilience, convinced that each encirclement marked the end of meaningful resistance. For the Soviets, desperation gave birth to grim determination. Soldiers fought knowing that retreat was not an option, driven by fear of the enemy and fear of their own commanders. Civilians worked tirelessly, convinced their sacrifices were the difference between survival and destruction. Rumors spread through Moscow that the Germans were at the gates, yet Stalin's refusal to evacuate steadied morale. Each Soviet counterattack, no matter how small, chipped at German confidence, showing that the Red Army still had fight left in it. The battle became as much a test of will as of weapons, and in that test, the Soviet Union was slowly hardening. By mid-October, German units reached the outer defensive belts of Moscow. their patrols within striking distance of the capital's suburbs. Yet the city they sought to seize was no longer the panicked Moscow of July. It was now a fortress bristling with defenses, manned by civilians, conscripts, and elite units alike. Soviet troops fought street by street in outlying towns, turning every village into a redoubt. The Luftwaffe bombed the city relentlessly, but Moscow endured under blackout curtains and underground shelters. German commanders sensed victory within their grasp, but they also knew their armies were stretched to the breaking point. Ammunition, fuel, and even food ran dangerously low, and their men shivered in the cold autumn rains. Still, von Bock and Guderian pressed their forces onward, determined to complete the mission. Hitler demanded Moscow be taken before the first snows fell, and as October drew to a close, the Wehrmacht prepared for its final push toward the capital. Operation Typhoon embodied both the brilliance and the fatal flaw of the German war machine. Its encirclements were masterpieces of tactical execution, yet each delayed the advance toward the ultimate objective. Its armies were powerful, but they were overstretched, worn down by distance, weather, and resistance. Moscow seemed tantalizingly close, but the window of opportunity was already closing. The Germans believed they were weeks away from triumph, yet in truth they were weeks away from disaster. For the Soviets, the battle was one of survival, each day bought with blood and sacrifice. Stalin and Zhukov understood that if they could hold until winter, the balance of power would shift. The storm that Hitler had named Typhoon was now colliding with forces he could not control: time, terrain, and weather. The drive on Moscow had begun with confidence and thunder. It would end in frost and fire, and the fate of the war hung in the balance. In early October 1941, the opening phase of Operation Typhoon unleashed its fury west of Moscow. German armored spearheads surged forward with breathtaking speed, their columns slicing into Soviet defenses along the Smolensk-Moscow axis. To the north, Hermann Hoth's Panzer Group 3 thrust toward Vyazma, while to the south, Heinz Guderian's Panzer Group 2 swung through Orel and Bryansk. Between them, Hoppner's Panzer Group 4 joined the assault, striking from the north in coordination with infantry from the 4th and 9th Armies. The objective was ambitious but clear: encircle entire Soviet armies defending Moscow's western approaches. The scale of the offensive dwarfed previous operations, involving nearly 2 million German troops, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. Soviet resistance was fierce but fragmented, unable to withstand the speed and coordination of the German thrusts. Within days, German spearheads had penetrated deep into the Soviet rear. The jaws of the encirclement began to close, and with them, the fate of hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers was sealed. At Vyazma, 150 miles west of Moscow, the German attack fell like a hammer on the Soviet western and reserve fronts. General Konev and Marshal Budyonny scrambled to organize defenses, but their lines buckled under the weight of German armor. Panzer columns raced forward, bypassing strongpoints and leaving infantry to mop up resistance. Entire Soviet divisions were cut off before they realized the full scope of the threat. By October 7th, the encirclement was complete. 4 Soviet armies, numbering over 600,000 men, were trapped in a vast pocket. German artillery rained down on the surrounded troops, while the Luftwaffe bombed roads, bridges, and supply depots into rubble. Soviet commanders urged breakout attempts, but German machine guns and tanks shredded retreating columns. Ammunition dwindled, food vanished, and soldiers resorted to eating horses and even stray dogs to survive. The forests around Vyazma became graveyards of men and machines, and the pocket, once filled with hope of breakout, became a slaughterhouse. To the south, Guderian's panzers struck with equal ferocity at Bryansk. Here, the Soviet Bryansk front under General Eremenko bore the brunt of the German assault. The fighting was brutal, with villages changing hands repeatedly as Soviet units resisted encirclement. Yet the speed of Guderian's advance was unstoppable, his tanks covering 50 miles in a matter of days. By mid-October, 3 more Soviet armies, over 250,000 men, were encircled in the Bryansk pocket. German infantry closed in from all sides, tightening the noose as Soviet soldiers fought desperately to escape. Many units broke into small groups, fleeing eastward through forests under cover of night. Others dug in, fighting to the last bullet before being overrun. Prisoner columns stretched for miles along dirt roads, guarded by weary German sentries. The Bryansk encirclement, though smaller than Vyazma, added to the catastrophic scale of Soviet losses. And together, the two pockets represented the greatest disaster yet for the Red Army. The numbers from Vyazma and Bryansk were staggering even to German commanders hardened by months of war. Over 1 million Soviet troops were killed, wounded, or captured in the twin encirclements. Entire Soviet fronts ceased to exist, their command structures obliterated, and their equipment lost. German soldiers marveled at the sight of endless prisoner columns, men marching in ragged uniforms, their faces hollow with exhaustion. Soviet generals, including several army commanders, were captured in the chaos, adding to the sense of total collapse. For the Wehrmacht, it was a victory beyond imagination, confirming their belief that Moscow was now defenseless. Propaganda trumpeted the triumph across Europe, hailing it as proof of Germany's invincibility. Officers spoke confidently of reaching Moscow within weeks, of ending the war before the first snows. Soldiers joked that they would spend Christmas in the Kremlin. The dream of conquest seemed within reach, and the road to Moscow lay open. Yet beneath the triumph, cracks were already beginning to show. German divisions were exhausted, their tanks worn down by endless marches and constant combat. Fuel shortages grew acute, forcing units to halt while waiting for supplies to catch up. The roads, already poor, were torn to pieces by autumn rains, turning into rivers of mud that swallowed trucks and guns. Horses collapsed in the mire, their carcasses littering the supply routes. Ammunition stocks dwindled as artillery fired, day after day, into the encircled pockets. The Luftwaffe, though still dominant, was strained by the need to support battles across a vast front. German soldiers, hardened by earlier victories, now found themselves fighting fatigue and hunger as much as the enemy. Even as they celebrated the capture of Soviet armies, they sensed the campaign was dragging into something far longer. The illusion of easy victory remained, but reality was beginning to intrude. For the Soviets, the disaster at Vyazma and Bryansk was catastrophic, but it did not break their will. Stalin demanded that Moscow be held at all costs, replacing faltering commanders with men like Zhukov, who understood the gravity of the situation. Reinforcements poured into the capital, including fresh divisions from Siberia that would soon tip the balance. Civilians were conscripted to dig trenches, build bunkers, and fortify every approach road. The encirclements, while devastating, bought time for the Soviets to mobilize reserves behind the front. Soldiers who escaped the pockets formed new units, retreating eastward to regroup for the defense of Moscow. Soviet propaganda, though forced to acknowledge heavy losses, emphasized the heroism of those who fought to the last. Tales of doomed resistance spread through the ranks, inspiring new recruits to match the sacrifices of their comrades. The Red Army was bloodied, but not destroyed. And from the ashes of Vyazma and Bryansk, Moscow's defenders rose with renewed determination. German commanders believed they had cleared the path to Moscow, but the scale of their victory masked the deeper reality. Each encirclement consumed precious weeks of time, delaying the advance toward the capital. Blitzkrieg relied on relentless momentum, and at Vyazma and Bryansk that momentum had been drained. The Soviets had lost armies, but the calendar had shifted in their favor. The rains of October deepened, turning roads into swamps that immobilized tanks and convoys. Winter loomed on the horizon, threatening to engulf the advancing Germans in ice and snow. Supplies of winter clothing had not been prepared, for Berlin had assumed the war would end before the cold arrived. Now soldiers faced the chilling prospect of fighting in summer uniforms against a winter-hardened foe. The encirclements were victories of destruction, but they were also victories of delay, and delay was the enemy of the German timetable. The encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk stand as one of the great paradoxes of the German campaign. They were triumphs of tactical brilliance, yet strategic disasters in disguise. The Red Army suffered horrendous losses, but the Soviet Union endured, rebuilding its strength in the shadow of Moscow. German armies pressed forward with confidence, yet they were already exhausted and ill-prepared for what lay ahead. Hitler celebrated the capture of prisoners, but prisoners did not end wars, time, will, and endurance did. As the Wehrmacht advanced toward Moscow, it did so on roads sinking in mud, beneath skies heavy with snow. The city still stood, fortified and defiant, waiting for the decisive clash. German soldiers believed they were marching to victory. In truth, they were marching into the crucible of failure, and the gates of Moscow would test them as no battlefield ever had. As the Wehrmacht closed in from the west, Moscow braced itself for a confrontation that would decide the fate of the Soviet Union. Panic rippled through the capital, yet Stalin refused to abandon his city, transforming fear into defiance. His orders were uncompromising. The capital would be held at all costs, and every citizen would play a role in its defense. The mobilization of Moscow's population was immediate and total, pulling men, women, and children into the war effort. Streets once filled with trams and shoppers became construction sites where civilians dug anti-tank ditches and raised barricades. College students carried rifles alongside factory workers, while school children filled sandbags for the city's defenses. The metro was converted into bomb shelters and command posts, its tunnels echoing with the hum of generators and the whispers of evacuees. Posters urged sacrifice with blunt slogans, "Everything for the front, everything for victory." For Stalin, Moscow was not only a city, it was the heart of the revolution, and to lose it was unthinkable. The Soviet war machine, though battered, underwent a transformation of staggering scale. In one of history's greatest logistical feats, thousands of factories were dismantled piece by piece and shipped east beyond the Ural Mountains. Entire assembly lines were loaded onto trains, along with workers, engineers, and their families. By autumn, more than 1,500 industrial plants had been relocated, their machinery reassembled in makeshift sheds and open fields. Men and women labored in freezing conditions to restart production, often working without roofs above their heads. The result was astonishing. New tanks, aircraft, and guns began rolling out of relocated factories, even as German forces advanced. The T-34 tank, produced in growing numbers, became the backbone of Soviet resistance, its armor and mobility proving superior to German designs. Aircraft factories in Siberia churned out Yak fighters and Il-2 Sturmovix, soon to dominate the skies over Moscow. The Soviets had not only preserved their industry, they had moved it beyond the reach of German bombers. In the crucible of invasion, Soviet production surged with renewed fury. Inside Moscow itself, daily life became inseparable from preparation for war. Barricades of cobblestones and timber rose across boulevards, while barbed wire stretched through parks and squares. anti-tank obstacles, nicknamed Czech hedgehogs, were scattered at key intersections to block armored columns. The Kremlin, long a symbol of Soviet power, was camouflaged with paint and netting to confuse enemy bombers. Civilians drilled in firefighting and first aid, preparing to face air raids and artillery bombardments. The sound of hammers and shovels echoed through the night as trenches were dug around the capital. Soldiers patrolled the streets with rifles, enforcing order and readiness. Families carried their belongings into metro stations each evening, turning platforms into underground villages of blankets and flickering candles. Fear hung heavy, but it was tempered by a grim determination. Moscow was no longer simply a city, it was a fortress preparing for siege. The mobilization extended beyond Moscow, sweeping across the Soviet Union with revolutionary zeal. In the countryside, peasants harvested crops for the front, often under fire from German aircraft strafing the fields. Women replaced men in factories, on farms, and even in combat roles, embodying Stalin's call that every hand is a weapon. Entire brigades of workers marched to the front as militias, armed with little more than rifles or Molotov cocktails. Engineers labored day and night to repair bridges and railroads destroyed by retreating Soviet units. In the Urals and Siberia, newly relocated plants became the beating heart of the war economy, producing steel, oil, and weapons at breakneck pace. Propaganda emphasized unity, portraying the war as a struggle for survival against annihilation. Songs, films, and posters celebrated the sacrifices of ordinary people, weaving their efforts into the mythology of resistance. Every citizen was told their labor was as vital as a soldier's rifle. The Soviet Union was becoming a nation at arms, and Moscow was the symbol around which all rallied. Stalin himself became both the architect and the symbol of defiance. In radio addresses, he spoke directly to his people, framing the war as a patriotic struggle akin to Russia's resistance against Napoleon in 1812. His words were measured, heavy with authority, and carried to every corner of the country. He invoked the spirit of Alexander Nevsky, Dmitry Donskoy, and Kutuzov, leaders who had defended Russia against invaders across the centuries. Stalin's decision to remain in Moscow during the darkest days of 1941 electrified morale, demonstrating that he would share the fate of his capital. His presence in the Kremlin, despite constant air raids, sent a message stronger than any speech. In meetings, he demanded ruthless discipline, punishing cowardice and rewarding steadfastness. He placed enormous trust in commanders like Zhukov, yet he maintained ultimate control over strategy. For Stalin, leadership was not only about orders, it was about embodying the will of the nation, and in 1941, his iron presence steadied a nation on the brink of collapse. The Soviet propaganda machine reinforced this narrative with relentless energy. Newspapers printed stories of heroic soldiers holding villages against impossible odds. Posters depicted workers forging steel with the words, "Our weapons will crush the fascist beast." Radio broadcasts celebrated the defense of every town, however small, portraying each as part of a great collective struggle. Cinema crews filmed footage of civilians digging trenches and militias training, transforming hardship into spectacle. Even defeat was reframed as sacrifice, meant to inspire rather than demoralize. The population, weary and frightened, clung to these messages as lifelines of hope. Songs about Moscow's endurance echoed through factories and shelters alike. The message was clear: survival was victory, and resistance was glory. The fortress of Moscow was as much psychological as it was physical, and Stalin's call to arms was amplified through every medium available. Behind the slogans and speeches, however, lay the unrelenting hardship of daily survival. Food rations shrank as supply lines strained, leaving families dependent on bread and thin soups. Winters arrived early, and many civilians lacked adequate clothing or fuel for warmth. Bombing raids left districts in ruins, killing thousands and driving survivors into underground shelters. Epidemics of typhus and dysentery spread among refugees who flooded into the capital from occupied territories. Yet the hardships became part of the narrative of defiance. Every sacrifice was portrayed as a contribution to the greater cause. Women gave up jewelry to fund the war effort, while children collected scrap metal for ammunition. Old men too frail for combat served as night watchmen or fire spotters on rooftops. Hardship was not hidden, it was weaponized into resilience, and in that resilience lay the soul of Moscow's defense. By November 1941, Moscow had transformed from a capital into a fortress, a bastion of resistance girded for the storm. Its citizens were no longer merely inhabitants but defenders, each assigned a role in the survival of the city. Its factories, once elegant showpieces of Soviet modernity, now clattered with the ceaseless production of war. Its streets bore scars of trenches and barricades, each an emblem of determination. The relocation of industry ensured that, even if Moscow fell, the Soviet Union would continue to fight. But the city's survival meant more than industry. It meant hope, legitimacy, and the soul of the nation. Stalin's call to arms had united a people under fire, transforming despair into resolve. The Germans believed Moscow would fall in weeks, yet Moscow stood braced, defiant, and unbroken, and the storm about to descend upon it would meet not a panicked city, but a fortress of will. As German armies pressed toward Moscow in October 1941, the city entered its darkest days. The once bustling Soviet capital, with its theaters, cafes, and grand boulevards, transformed into a city of shadows under the constant threat of attack. German bombers flying from captured airfields to the west swept over the city at night, their engines droning like harbingers of death. Searchlights crisscrossed the skies, probing the darkness for enemy aircraft, while anti-aircraft guns thundered from rooftops. Explosions shattered the night, raining glass and debris onto streets below. Civilians huddled in metro stations, clutching children and bundles of belongings as dust fell from the ceilings with every impact. Fires raged through residential blocks, fought by brigades of men and women who battled blazes with little more than buckets and hand pumps. The once proud skyline of Moscow was now punctuated with plumes of smoke, testifying to the price of defiance. For many, each night became a question of survival, yet each morning the city rose again, determined to endure. The German air offensive sought to terrorize as much as to destroy. Bombing raids targeted factories, rail junctions, and power stations. But they also struck civilian neighborhoods with ruthless frequency. The Luftwaffe hoped to break morale, to shatter the will of a city that had become the heart of Soviet resistance. But Stalin refused to allow panic to spread, insisting that life in the capital continue as normally as possible. Shops reopened after raids, theaters staged performances, and schools resumed lessons in bomb shelters. The message was clear: Moscow would not be paralyzed by fear. At night, the metro became a subterranean village of families, soldiers, and workers, its tunnels echoing with lullabies and whispered prayers. Above ground, entire brigades of firefighters and medics patrolled the ruins, bracing for the next wave. Bombing did not weaken the city, it hardened it. The more the Luftwaffe struck, the deeper Moscow's resolve grew. Around the outskirts of the capital, a vast system of defensive lines took shape. Soviet engineers, soldiers, and civilians dug trench after trench, carving a belt of fortifications across the frozen earth. Barbed wire entanglements, stretched across open fields, while tank traps and wooden barricades blocked roads. Concrete bunkers rose at key junctions, manned by soldiers with machine guns and mortars. Bridges were mined, ready to be blown at the first sign of German armor. Anti-aircraft batteries dotted the perimeter, their barrels pointed skyward in anticipation of Luftwaffe raids. Thousands of civilians joined the effort, their hands blistered from shovels, their backs bent under the weight of earthworks. Elderly men dug alongside teenagers, while women carried logs and rocks to reinforce barricades. The city became a fortress, every street and field transformed into a battlefield in waiting. Moscow was no longer simply a capital, it was a citadel of resistance. The mobilization of civilians reached unprecedented levels, binding the population to the fate of their city. Workers who had once assembled machinery in factories now hauled sandbags and laid mines on the outskirts. Housewives exchanged kitchen aprons for spades, joining brigades tasked with digging trenches. Students, some barely in their teens, carried buckets of earth in endless lines to deepen anti-tank ditches. Cultural landmarks, from the Bolshoi Theatre to Lenin's mausoleum, were camouflaged under paint and scaffolding to confuse enemy bombers. Government offices were fortified with sandbags, their corridors lined with soldiers. The entire city became a single military organism, each citizen a cell within its body. Soviet propaganda celebrated these efforts with photographs and posters, portraying them as acts of patriotic heroism. Yet behind the images lay exhaustion, hunger, and fear. Still, the work continued without pause, driven by the knowledge that survival depended on it. Moscow's people had become its army. The German threat was not only from the skies, but also from the advancing armies, drawing closer by the day. Reports filtered into the capital that German patrols had reached towns only 30 miles from the city. Rumors spread like wildfire that tanks were already at the gates, fueling panic among civilians. Crowds surged at railway stations, desperate for trains heading east, their belongings stuffed into sacks and trunks. At the same time, thousands of volunteers rushed to enlist in the militia, determined to fight for their homes. These irregular units, often poorly armed, took up positions alongside regular soldiers, ready to face the enemy head-on. The contrast between fear and courage defined the atmosphere in Moscow. Despair hovered over the city, yet defiance burned fiercely alongside it. Stalin's refusal to evacuate steadied the wavering, sending a message that retreat was not an option. The capital would stand, or it would fall fighting. Life inside the city grew harsher with each passing week. Food supplies dwindled, leaving citizens to subsist on thin rations of bread and potatoes. Long queues formed at bakeries, where families waited hours for meager portions. Coal and firewood became scarce, and the bitter chill of October seeped into homes and shelters alike. Air raid sirens wailed nightly, depriving civilians of rest and driving them underground. Disease spread through crowded metro stations, where thousands of families lived in constant confinement. Yet amid hardship, a culture of endurance emerged, binding people together in solidarity. Neighbors shared scraps of food, strangers carried one another's burdens, and every act of kindness became a weapon against despair. Priests held quiet prayers in basements, while poets recited verses that blended grief with defiance. Moscow endured not just with weapons, but with spirit, and that spirit would prove as vital as any tank or gun. For the German High Command, the sight of Moscow's defenses was unexpected and unsettling. Reconnaissance revealed not a city waiting to collapse, but a fortress girded with trenches, bunkers, and countless defenders. The Wehrmacht had envisioned parading into a demoralized capital, yet what awaited them was a population transformed into soldiers. Hitler's orders to seize the city collided with the stark reality of Moscow's preparations. Von Bock and his generals realized that capturing the Soviet capital would require not only strength but a level of attrition they had hoped to avoid. Each day the city fortified itself further, its lines of defense growing deeper and more resilient. The psychological impact of this realization weighed heavily on German commanders. They had triumphed in battles of maneuver, but now they faced a siege against a nation that refused to yield. The closer they came, the further victory seemed to slip away, and Moscow stood waiting with clenched fists. By November, the capital was a city under siege in all but name. German armies pressed closer, their artillery audible in the distance, their patrols clashing with Soviet outposts on the outskirts. Bombers still darkened the skies, dropping destruction upon a population that refused to flee. Trenches and barricades scarred the cityscape, reminders that every street would be contested if the enemy broke through. Civilians carried on with their work under the roar of planes, their daily lives inseparable from the defense of their homes. Stalin's speeches reverberated across radio waves, reminding the people that the eyes of the world were upon them. The Soviet capital had become the stage on which history itself seemed to pause, waiting for the outcome of the coming battle. The Germans believed they were tightening the noose. In reality, they were awakening a city prepared to fight to its last breath, and the siege of Moscow was only beginning. In the autumn of 1941, as the Wehrmacht surged toward Moscow, Stalin faced a moment of truth. The capital teetered on the edge of collapse, its defenses strained by the relentless weight of German armor. Panic gripped the city, yet Stalin remained defiant, determined to find a commander who could hold the line. His choice fell on Georgy Zhukov, a soldier forged in the crucible of relentless struggle. Zhukov had earned Stalin's trust by his victory at Kholkhin Gol in 1939, where he shattered Japanese forces with decisive speed. Unlike many officers cowed by Stalin's authority, Zhukov combined loyalty with blunt honesty, unafraid to speak unwelcome truths. He was summoned to the Kremlin in October, recalled from the defense of Leningrad to save Moscow. Stalin looked him in the eye and handed him the impossible task: defend the capital at all costs. Zhukov accepted without hesitation, his expression as hard as the granite of Red Square. In that moment, Moscow gained not just a general, but a bulwark. Zhukov's leadership style was unrelenting, a blend of discipline, pragmatism, and ferocious energy. He drove his subordinates to exhaustion, demanding clarity in planning and precision in execution. Soldiers both feared and respected him, for he tolerated no excuses and brooked no weakness. Yet he was no mere tyrant. He inspired confidence by his presence at the front, walking among the men and sharing their hardships. He had an instinct for positioning reserves, always ready to counter a German breakthrough with sudden force. His ability to coordinate infantry, armor, and artillery set him apart from commanders still learning the complexities of modern war. Above all, he radiated an aura of inevitability, as if defeat was simply not in his vocabulary. Under Zhukov, despair hardened into determination, and chaos began to take the shape of order. His methods were brutal, but his results undeniable. Moscow's fate now rested in his iron grip. The first task Zhukov faced was the reorganization of battered Soviet armies retreating toward Moscow. Units that had survived the disasters of Vyazma and Bryansk arrived in fragments, companies reduced to platoons, divisions barely resembling their original strength. Zhukov consolidated these remnants into cohesive formations, blending veterans with fresh recruits rushed from the east. He insisted on strict discipline, even executing deserters to set an example for others. Command structures were rebuilt overnight, with new officers promoted from the ranks to replace those lost. At the same time, he oversaw the creation of reserve armies, assembled from Siberian divisions, workers' militias, and conscripts drawn from the capital itself. These reserves were positioned in depth, designed to absorb the German blows and then counterattack. Zhukov's genius lay not in miracles, but in squeezing every ounce of strength from broken forces. The Red Army around Moscow was still fragile, but under his command it began to breathe again. The shattered shield was reforged. Stalin monitored every decision from the Kremlin, yet he recognized that Zhukov's instincts often surpassed his own. Their relationship was tense, marked by sharp arguments and moments of near defiance. When Stalin suggested rash counterattacks, Zhukov pushed back, insisting on conserving strength for decisive moments. Unlike many subordinates who feared Stalin's wrath, Zhukov's bluntness earned him grudging respect. Stalin, for all his paranoia, understood that Zhukov was a commander who could deliver results under impossible conditions. The two men forged an uneasy partnership, Stalin providing political will, Zhukov delivering military resolve. In their combined determination, Moscow found its leadership. Stalin embodied defiance in the face of annihilation, while Zhukov turned that defiance into strategy. Their alliance was not one of warmth, but of necessity. And in necessity lay the survival of the Soviet Union. Under Zhukov's direction, the defenses of Moscow were transformed into a multi-layered fortress. The first defensive belt stretched along the Mozhaysk line, a chain of fortified positions west of the city. Behind it, a second belt was constructed, manned by fresh recruits and hastily armed militia units. Further east, within Moscow itself, barricades and strongpoints turned every street into a potential battlefield. Artillery batteries were dug into concealed positions, waiting to unleash fire on advancing German columns. Anti-aircraft guns lined rooftops, their crews scanning the skies for the next wave of Luftwaffe bombers. The city was ringed by trenches, tank obstacles, and minefields designed to slow the German advance. Soldiers were ordered to dig until their hands bled, building fortifications that stretched for miles. Zhukov demanded constant reports, ensuring no sector was left vulnerable. Moscow was no longer just a political capital. It was now the center of a defensive machine. The Siberian divisions, long held in the east to guard against Japan, began arriving in Moscow under Zhukov's command. These troops were hardened by brutal winters, their white camouflage and fur-lined uniforms, stark contrasts to the Wehrmacht's threadbare gear. They brought with them modern equipment, including the T-34 and KV-1 tanks, which German weapons struggled to destroy. Their discipline and training stood out immediately, inspiring confidence among exhausted Soviet defenders. Zhukov integrated them carefully, deploying them where their shock value would be greatest. The Germans, accustomed to overmatched Soviet troops, suddenly faced opponents who fought with skill and ferocity. The Siberians became the steel in Zhukov's counterpunch, their presence a secret advantage born of Stalin's espionage network in Japan. For Moscow, their arrival meant more than reinforcements. It meant hope, and hope was the weapon the city needed most. Even as he rebuilt the front, Zhukov never lost sight of the psychological battle. He knew that soldiers who believed in their cause fought harder than those who feared alone. He visited trenches, spoke with commanders, and appeared at critical points during German assaults. His presence on the battlefield carried weight, reminding men that they were not abandoned to fate. Soldiers later recalled his piercing eyes, his sharp words, and his ability to cut through panic with blunt authority. Zhukov demanded discipline, but he also offered clarity, stripping away confusion in moments of chaos. He told his men not that victory was certain, but that survival depended on their will. This honesty, rare in an army where propaganda often masked reality, bound soldiers to him with loyalty born of trust. Under his gaze, men fought harder, longer, and with greater resolve. In Zhukov, they found the embodiment of endurance. By November 1941, Moscow stood under siege, its fate balanced on a knife's edge. Yet, thanks to Zhukov's leadership, its defenses had coalesced into a formidable shield. The city was no longer merely waiting for rescue. It was prepared to fight tooth and nail for every street. Stalin's decision to appoint Zhukov had given the capital not just a commander, but a figure of iron who embodied its will to survive. The German advance had not stopped, but it had slowed, gnawed at by resistance and hampered by defenses. The Red Army, reorganized and reinforced, was ready for the storm that was coming. Soldiers and civilians alike drew strength from the man who now directed their fate. In Zhukov's command, Moscow had found its heartbeat, and as winter approached, that heartbeat echoed with defiance. The battle for the Soviet capital was entering its most desperate phase. By late October 1941, the spearheads of Army Group Center were pushing through the last defensive belts west of Moscow. German panzers advanced toward Moshisk and Kaluga, towns whose names soon became synonymous with desperate Soviet resistance. Columns of armor rumbled down rutted, rain-soaked roads, their treads churning mud into deep scars across the landscape. Infantry trudged beside them, soaked to the bone yet convinced they were part of history's greatest triumph. Each mile eastward brought them closer to the capital, their maps now showing distances measured in tens of miles rather than hundreds. Reconnaissance patrols reported the spires of Moscow within reach, visible from elevated ground on clear days. For many soldiers, it felt as though the campaign was nearly over, the last surge before a final victory. German propaganda broadcasts boasted that Moscow's fall was imminent, a matter of days rather than weeks. Leaflets dropped on the city predicted its collapse before the first snow, and the soldiers believed it. At Moshisk, the Soviets had hastily assembled a defensive line manned by exhausted units and raw recruits. German armored formations struck with overwhelming force, their artillery softening Soviet trenches before tanks surged forward. The defenders fought with desperation, but they were heavily outnumbered and outgunned. Villages became battlegrounds where houses were reduced to rubble by artillery and flamethrowers. German infantry advanced methodically, clearing strong points one by one as resistance was crushed. Kaluga, to the south, fell after brutal street fighting, its defenders overwhelmed by sheer firepower. For the Germans, these victories reinforced the sense that Moscow was theirs for the taking. Soviet lines seemed to crumble as quickly as they were built, with reserves fed into the battle only to be consumed. Officers reported that the enemy was at the brink of collapse, incapable of further serious resistance. And yet, beneath the surface, Soviet resolve only hardened. German propaganda seized upon these victories, projecting confidence to the home front and the troops alike. Newspapers in Berlin declared that Moscow would soon be in German hands, the jewel of the Eastern Campaign. Radio broadcasts described the Red Army as broken and demoralized, incapable of meaningful defense. Posters proclaimed the dawn of a new age, with the Soviet Union on the verge of destruction. Soldiers at the front echoed these sentiments, writing letters home that spoke of imminent triumph. Many believed they would spend Christmas in Moscow, perhaps even celebrate the New Year back in Germany. Officers reassured their men that winter clothing was unnecessary, for the campaign would end before the cold set in. The aura of invincibility, born in France and Poland, still lingered despite the mounting difficulties. In the imagination of the Wehrmacht, Moscow was already conquered. All that remained was the march into the city. Yet the reality on the ground was more complicated than the propaganda admitted. Soviet defenses, though shattered, reformed again and again, fed by reserves drawn from Moscow itself. The capital became a reservoir of manpower, its civilians transformed into soldiers at a moment's notice. German patrols, probing deeper into the outskirts, encountered ambushes that inflicted unexpected losses. Supply convoys struggled to keep pace, with trucks bogged down in mud or destroyed by Soviet partisans operating behind the lines. Tanks ran low on fuel, sometimes immobilized within sight of their objectives. Ammunition shortages forced units to ration shells, weakening the impact of artillery bombardments. Despite this, confidence at the top remained unshaken, with von Bock and his staff insisting that final victory was within grasp. Hitler, obsessed with symbols, believed the fall of Moscow would shatter Soviet morale beyond repair. German divisions pushed forward with determination, but each step toward the capital grew heavier. The German High Command envisioned Moscow not merely as a military objective but as a psychological prize. Its fall would mirror the capture of Paris in 1940, a symbolic blow that would resonate across the world. Foreign observers, from Tokyo to Madrid, were already speculating on the collapse of the Soviet Union. Within the Reich, civilians anticipated an announcement at any moment that the Red Banner had been torn down over the Kremlin. This atmosphere of inevitability spread through the ranks, bolstering morale, despite the worsening weather. Yet Moscow was not Paris, it was larger, fortified, and filled with defenders who viewed surrender as death. The closer the Wehrmacht came, the more ferocious the Soviet resistance grew, as if proximity to the capital infused its soldiers with greater resolve. German officers noted this paradox, but dismissed it as desperation. In reality, it was the foundation of Soviet survival, and it would soon test the Wehrmacht to its limits. At the tactical level, the battles west of Moscow exposed the contradictions of German confidence. Panzers excelled in open fields, but around Moscow, the terrain narrowed into forests, rivers, and marshes. Soviet engineers destroyed bridges, forcing the Germans to halt and rebuild crossings under fire. Villages fortified by militias forced German infantry into costly close-quarters fighting. Each advance that looked smooth on maps became a brutal slog of mud, blood, and exhaustion on the ground. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin, could no longer guarantee constant air cover, giving Soviet bombers rare opportunities to strike. Winter loomed in the skies above, the first frosts already forming on vehicles left overnight. Yet soldiers remained convinced they were close to the end. The maps told them Moscow was near, but the land beneath their boots told a harsher story. As October turned to November, the Wehrmacht reached its high water mark west of Moscow. Patrols advanced to Krasnaya Polyana, barely 20 miles from the city center. From elevated ground, German troops claimed they could see the spires of the Kremlin through binoculars. It was the closest they would ever come to their objective, the moment when victory seemed inevitable. German officers boasted that the final push was imminent, that Moscow would fall within days. Yet even as they celebrated, the first snowflakes fell, dusting vehicles and uniforms in white. The roads hardened into ice, and the temperature dropped with merciless speed. Soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets and stolen Soviet coats, still waiting for official winter gear that never arrived. They were within sight of their prize, but their strength was ebbing, and unseen to them Soviet reinforcements were already gathering for a counterblow. The confidence of the Wehrmacht at the gates of Moscow was both its strength and its undoing. Soldiers believed they had already won, and that belief carried them forward against impossible odds. But it blinded them to the reality of their situation. Exhaustion, stretched supply lines, and a foe unwilling to break. German propaganda promised the fall of Moscow, yet each day the city still stood was a silent victory for the Soviets. The Mozháysk and Kaluga offensives had delivered tactical successes, but they had failed to break Soviet will. Instead, they had brought the Germans to the edge of overextension, within reach of a city they could not seize. The capital loomed ahead, defiant, fortified, and unbroken. German soldiers thought they were marching into triumph. In truth, they were marching into the jaws of winter, and Moscow was waiting to strike back. As October deepened, nature itself became the Soviet Union's most powerful ally. The skies opened with relentless autumn rains, turning the roads of western Russia into seas of mud. German soldiers who had advanced swiftly across France's paved highways now found themselves trapped in a landscape that swallowed machines whole. Tanks bogged down in swamps of sticky clay, their engines straining and tracks spinning uselessly. Trucks laden with fuel and ammunition sank axle-deep, abandoned by crews who could no longer move them. Horses pulling artillery collapsed in exhaustion, their bodies lying lifeless along the supply routes. Infantry slogged through knee-deep muck, their boots coated in layers of mud so heavy they could scarcely march. Progress slowed to a crawl, measured not in miles but in yards each day. The momentum of blitzkrieg, once unstoppable, dissolved into paralysis, and in the mire of the Russian Rasputitsa, the German timetable was shattered. The Rasputitsa, the dreaded season of mud, was not merely an inconvenience but a strategic disaster. Entire convoys of supplies ground to a halt, their contents abandoned or looted by partisans. Fuel, already scarce, failed to reach the front in sufficient quantities, forcing panzers to stand idle. Ammunition deliveries were delayed for days, leaving artillery batteries unable to fire at critical moments. German soldiers found themselves living in a swamp, their trenches filled with water that froze at night and thawed during the day. Weapons rusted in the damp, while food spoiled in the muck, spreading sickness among exhausted troops. Morale plummeted as soldiers cursed the land that resisted them at every step. Commanders raged at the delays, but their orders meant little when the earth itself was the enemy. The Russians, long accustomed to seasons, knew how to fight in such conditions. The Germans, unprepared, discovered that even nature had chosen sides. Logistics, always the lifeblood of any campaign, now became the Wehrmacht's greatest weakness. Supply depots stretched hundreds of miles back toward Poland, each link in the chain vulnerable to weather and Soviet resistance. Partisan attacks on railways and convoys compounded the crisis, destroying bridges and ambushing trucks. German engineers worked frantically to repair roads and lay down corduroy tracks of logs, but the effort could not keep pace. Panzer divisions, once the cutting edge of blitzkrieg, now waited helplessly for fuel that never came. Infantry divisions, starved of rations, resorted to slaughtering local livestock or raiding villages to survive. Soldiers gnawed on frozen bread and boiled horse meat, their diets collapsing as supply lines disintegrated. Medical supplies dwindled, leaving wounds untreated and infections spreading. The promise of swift conquest had depended on precision and speed. But in the mud of Russia, the gears of the German war machine ground to a halt. As the Germans wallowed in the mire, the Soviets adapted with remarkable resilience. Red Army units used the mud to their advantage, counterattacking stalled columns with small but relentless assaults. Cavalry divisions, still employed by the Soviets, moved across terrain where German vehicles could not follow. Peasant carts carried supplies along paths invisible to mechanized invaders, sustaining defenders while their enemies starved. Soviet soldiers, already familiar with hardship, endured the conditions with grim acceptance. For them, the mud was not an obstacle but a shield, slowing the German juggernaut until reinforcements arrived. Stalin and his generals seized the opportunity, rushing new units to Moscow's defenses under cover of the weather. Civilians continued to dig trenches and fortifications, their work uninterrupted by the paralyzed enemy. For the first time since June, it was not the Germans dictating the pace of the campaign. It was Russia itself, and Russia was merciless. Then, in early November, the rains gave way to snow and the battlefield was transformed again. Temperatures plummeted rapidly, turning rivers into ice and mud into frozen ruts. At first, German soldiers welcomed the frost, believing it would harden the ground and allow vehicles to move again. Tanks and trucks rolled forward, freed from the clinging mud that had held them captive. But the relief was short-lived, for the cold was harsher than anything they had anticipated. Thermometers dropped to -20 degrees Celsius, freezing fuel lines and cracking engines. Soldiers lacked proper winter clothing, still wearing the light uniforms of summer campaigns. Boots fell apart in the frost, leaving men with frost-bitten feet wrapped in rags. Weapons jammed as oil thickened into sludge, rendering rifles and machine guns useless in combat. What seemed at first like salvation became a new nightmare, and the German army was woefully unprepared. The first snowstorms swept across the front, blinding troops and burying vehicles under drifts. German supply convoys, already faltering, now collapsed entirely as roads vanished beneath sheets of ice. Horses died by the thousands, their bodies frozen in place where they had fallen. Soldiers huddled in shallow dugouts, their breath crystallizing in the air, their hands too numb to grip rifles. Frostbite spread rapidly, with fingers and toes turning black before amputations could be performed. Thousands of men were lost not to bullets, but to the merciless Russian winter. Rations froze solid, requiring soldiers to hack bread apart with bayonets. Fires could rarely be lit without drawing Soviet artillery, leaving troops to shiver through endless nights. The cold was an enemy that respected no rank, cutting down generals and privates alike, and the Wehrmacht discovered that its greatest adversary was not the Red Army, but the elements. German propaganda, so confident only weeks before, faltered in the face of reality. Promises of Moscow's imminent fall now rang hollow as soldiers wrote home of freezing nights and stalled offensives. Letters spoke of comrades collapsing from frostbite, of machines that refused to start, of spirits broken by endless suffering. Officers attempted to maintain morale, insisting that victory was still within reach. But the evidence on the ground was undeniable. The German army had lost the element of speed. Soviet radio broadcasts mocked the invaders, reminding them of Napoleon's fate in 1812. Comparisons with the Grande Armée spread through the ranks, whispered in dugouts as soldiers cursed their leaders. For many, the dream of celebrating Christmas in Moscow had been replaced by the fear of never returning home. The Wehrmacht had reached its high water mark, and the tide was turning against them. The transformation of the battlefield from mud to snow marked a turning point in the struggle for Moscow. The Rasputia had slowed the Germans, bleeding away their momentum in fields of muck and despair. The arrival of winter finished the work, immobilizing an army unprepared for such extremes. Blitzkrieg, once a doctrine of speed and precision, collapsed into stagnation against the vastness of Russia. Supply lines, once the arteries of conquest, froze into lifeless veins stretching back across the steppe. Soldiers who had marched in confidence now shivered in misery, their faith in victory shaken. Meanwhile, the Soviets grew stronger with every passing week, their defenses hardening as reinforcements arrived. The stage was set for a dramatic reversal, one that would echo through the course of the war. The Germans had reached the gates of Moscow, but the gates refused to open, and winter itself had become the capital's strongest defender. As German forces strained toward Moscow, the Soviet strongholds of Tula and Klin emerged as bulwarks of resistance. These industrial cities, lying south and north of the capital respectively, became linchpins in the battle for survival. Tula, renowned for its weapons factories and centuries-old tradition of arms production, was critical to supplying the Red Army. Klin, guarding the northern approaches, controlled vital road and rail links leading into Moscow's flank. The Germans sought to crush both cities, believing their fall would unhinge the Soviet defense of the capital. But the defenders, soldiers and civilians alike, resolved that surrender was not an option. They built barricades across streets, fortified factories, and turned every building into a redoubt. German tanks that rolled into the outskirts found themselves facing not only soldiers, but entire populations armed with rifles, grenades, and Molotov cocktails. The siege of these cities would test the invaders' strength, and the Soviets proved stronger than anticipated. Tula's defense became legendary, a story of grit and sacrifice under overwhelming odds. In late October, Guderian's panzer division surged northward after capturing Orel and Mentsensk, aiming to seize Tula before Moscow. Expecting a swift victory, they were stunned to encounter fierce resistance from the city's garrison. Workers' militias, hastily armed with rifles and machine guns, manned the barricades alongside regular Red Army troops. Women and children carried ammunition, dug trenches, and tended to the wounded under constant bombardment. The weapons factories continued to produce rifles and shells, even as German artillery rained destruction upon them. German armor advanced into the suburbs, but was met with devastating fire from hidden anti-tank guns. The defenders counterattacked in brutal street fighting, forcing the panzers to retreat. Tula refused to fall, its defenders declaring it a city of steel, and their stand bought Moscow precious time. The battle for Klin to the north mirrored the intensity of Tula's ordeal. German divisions advanced rapidly toward the city in mid-November, seeking to break through to the Moscow-Volga Canal. The Soviet High Command recognized the danger and rushed reinforcements to the sector, including units of the 30th Army. Snowstorms and freezing winds turned the battlefield into a white wasteland, but neither side relented. German armor pressed forward, attempting to envelop Klin from multiple directions. Soviet defenders fought with desperation, clinging to each district in savage house-to-house battles. Factories and warehouses were converted into strongholds, their windows spitting fire at advancing infantry. Civilians joined the fight, hurling grenades from rooftops and setting tanks ablaze with gasoline bottles. For days the city was engulfed in smoke and flame, each street contested with ferocious determination. Klin became a fortress of resistance, and its defenders denied the Germans the breakthrough they craved. The industrial significance of these cities cannot be overstated. Tula's armament factories continued to turn out weapons even while under siege, sending rifles and machine guns directly from production lines to the front. Klin's rail junctions provided lifelines for supplies and reinforcements to Moscow's northern front. Their survival ensured that the Soviet capital remained connected, supplied, and defended despite German encirclement attempts. Every shell fired, every rifle carried, was a product of these industrial strongholds refusing to fall silent. The Germans, stretched thin and exhausted by months of relentless campaigning, found themselves in a war of attrition they had not anticipated. Each failure to seize these cities weakened their grip on the larger offensive. For the Soviets, every day Tula and Klin stood was a day closer to reinforcements arriving from the east. The factory smoke mixed with the smoke of battle, and both symbolized a nation that refused to yield. The weather compounded German frustrations, turning their assaults into grueling slogs. Tanks, already hampered by mud and ice, broke down in the freezing conditions. Fuel convoys, harassed by partisans and crippled by the cold, failed to keep pace with the advancing front. Soldiers shivered in thin uniforms, huddling in ruined buildings for warmth as Soviet shells rained down. Frostbite and hunger gnawed at morale, leaving many units fighting at half strength. In contrast, Soviet defenders supplied with winter gear and bolstered by Siberian reinforcements grew stronger with each passing week. They fought not only with weapons, but with the knowledge that Moscow stood just behind them. To hold Tula and Klin was to protect the capital's flanks, to ensure the heart of the Soviet Union did not bleed. German commanders pressed their men forward, but progress slowed to a crawl, and in the icy winds, confidence began to freeze. The defenders' heroism was etched into the fabric of the struggle. In Tula, militia units armed with little more than rifles held off entire panzer battalions. Women worked double shifts in factories, producing ammunition by day and guarding barricades by night. In Klin, Soviet tank crews ambushed German columns in narrow streets, their T-34 set emerging from concealment to unleash devastating fire. Soldiers dug trenches in frozen ground with bare hands, refusing to abandon their posts. Medics carried wounded comrades through blizzards, often under fire, their stretchers leaving trails in the snow. Entire neighborhoods became fortresses, with civilians fighting alongside soldiers in a collective stand. The Germans expected cities to collapse under bombardment. Instead, they became stronger with each assault. The stories of sacrifice spread across Moscow, inspiring defenders on every front. Tula and Klin became not just battles, they became symbols of defiance. German frustration boiled as their timetable collapsed. Commanders who had promised victory before winter now faced stalemates in frozen streets. Hitler raged at reports from the front, demanding Moscow be taken regardless of cost. Yet his armies were exhausted, their strength bleeding away in countless small battles. Every assault on Tula or Klin consumed fuel, ammunition, and men the Germans could not spare. Meanwhile, Soviet reinforcements continued to arrive, pouring into the line like fresh steel. For the first time, the Wehrmacht's aura of invincibility faltered. Soldiers whispered that perhaps the Russians could not be broken after all. The spectre of another Napoleon haunted them, a conqueror who had also reached Moscow's gates but never returned. The seeds of doubt were sown amid the snows of Tula and Klin, and doubt was as deadly as any Soviet rifle. By late November, both Tula and Klin still stood, battered but unbroken. Their defenders had achieved what seemed impossible, holding back the most powerful army in Europe. The factories of Tula continued to supply the Red Army, while Klin's defences ensured Moscow's northern flank remained intact. German attempts to encircle the capital had failed, their armies now locked in attrition. They could not win. For the Soviets, these victories were more than tactical. They were psychological, proof that the Wehrmacht could be resisted. The heroism of the defenders became legend, retold in speeches, newspapers, and songs across the Soviet Union. Stalin declared that the city's stand marked a turning point in the struggle. To the German command, they were obstacles that refused to vanish. And to the world, they showed that Moscow was not yet lost. In the frozen ruins of Tula and Klin, the tide of war began to shift. By late October 1941, Moscow trembled on the edge of catastrophe. German armies stood within striking distance, their artillery thunder audible from the city's outskirts. Rumors raced through the streets that the capital would fall within days, and that Soviet leaders were preparing to abandon it. Panic gripped the population as families rushed to railway stations, desperate to flee eastward. Trains groaned under the weight of evacuees, their carriages packed with officials, workers, and ordinary civilians alike. Government offices began the hurried transfer of archives, blueprints, and priceless documents to the interior. The treasures of the Kremlin, from icons to historical relics, were crated and sent beyond the Urals for safekeeping. Factories dismantled their machines and shipped them eastward, even as workers continued producing weapons for the front. The capital seemed poised on the brink of evacuation, as though history itself was about to retreat from Moscow. Yet at the heart of the storm, Stalin stood firm. The evacuation was both orderly and chaotic, a reflection of the desperate times. Commissars oversaw the transfer of ministries to Kiev, a city chosen as the provisional seat of government should Moscow fall. Thousands of officials departed, carrying typewriters, ledgers, and communications equipment on overloaded trucks. Embassies shuttered their doors, foreign diplomats fleeing in convoys toward the Volga. Civilians packed belongings into suitcases and sacks, many leaving behind homes they knew they would never see again. The sound of trains departing became the soundtrack of the city, the shriek of whistles blending with distant artillery. Yet not everyone could leave. Millions of ordinary Muscovites had no choice but to remain, clinging to the city that was their world. The contrast between those who fled and those who stayed deepened the sense of crisis. Moscow felt hollowed out, its streets both crowded with fear and strangely empty of authority. The question lingered in the air. Would the city be abandoned? Rumors spread with uncontrollable speed, feeding panic among the population. Whispers claimed the Germans had already entered the suburbs, that tanks had been sighted near the Kremlin. Some swore that Stalin himself had fled the city, leaving Moscow to its fate. Shop shelves emptied as people hoarded what little food they could find, fearing starvation during a siege. Banks closed their doors, and currency lost its meaning as barter replaced rubles. Black markets flourished in alleys, where desperate citizens traded watches and clothes for bread or potatoes. Night after night, the wail of air raid sirens drove families into the metro, where they waited in suffocating darkness. The mood of the city swung wildly between despair and defiance, between whispered doom and shouted slogans of survival. Fear stalked every street, but so too did the determination to endure. In Moscow's darkest hour, rumor and reality became indistinguishable. Amid the panic, Stalin made the most consequential decision of his rule. He would not leave Moscow. Advisors urged him to relocate eastward, arguing that his survival was essential for the war effort. Military leaders warned that the city could not be held against the full weight of the Wehrmacht. Yet Stalin refused, declaring that abandoning the capital would mean abandoning the soul of the nation. He chose to remain in the Kremlin, beneath the constant threat of air raids, directing the defense of the city. His presence steadied nerves, sending a message that Moscow was not yet lost. Stalin understood the symbolic power of leadership, that his physical presence in the capital mattered as much as strategy. By staying, he tied his fate to that of Moscow, binding himself to the destiny of its people. It was a gamble of immense magnitude, but it gave the city a spine of iron. The most dramatic moment came on November 7th, the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Despite the proximity of German forces, Stalin ordered the annual military parade to proceed on Red Square. At dawn, troops marched through falling snow, their boots striking the cobblestones in perfect rhythm. Tanks rumbled past the Kremlin walls, their engines growling in defiance of the enemy, barely 30 miles away. Stalin himself stood on Lenin's mausoleum, addressing soldiers and citizens with words of steel. His speech invoked the great defenders of Russia's past, Alexander Nevsky, Dmitry Donskoy, and Kutuzov, who had repelled invaders from the west. He declared that Moscow would not fall, that the enemy would be crushed before its gates. The soldiers, cheered by the crowd, marched directly from the parade to the front lines. The spectacle was as much psychological as military, a display of unshakable resolve, and it transformed despair into determination. The parade had an impact far beyond Moscow's walls. News of Stalin's defiance spread across the Soviet Union, broadcast by radio and repeated in newspapers. Soldiers at the front, many half-starved and frostbitten, drew strength from the knowledge that their leader remained in the capital. Civilians in besieged cities like Leningrad took heart, convinced that Moscow's example proved survival was possible. Even abroad, the parade impressed allies who had doubted the Soviet Union's ability to endure. In Berlin, the spectacle infuriated Hitler, who had promised his people that the city was about to fall. For the Soviet people, it became a turning point, the moment when despair began to give way to defiance. The symbolism of soldiers marching to war from Red Square was indelible, a living statement of resilience. The anniversary of revolution became the anniversary of survival, and Moscow, though trembling, stood unbroken. Behind the parades and speeches, however, hardship remained relentless. Food shortages worsened, with rations reduced to bare survival levels. Winter's winds cut through the city, leaving families shivering in unheated apartments. Bombing raids continued, scattering rubble across neighborhoods already scarred by trenches and barricades. Disease spread in crowded shelters, adding to the toll of war. Yet even in these conditions, life carried on with stubborn persistence. Schools continued lessons in basements, theaters staged plays in underground halls, and newspapers rolled off presses despite shortages of ink and paper. Muscovites endured because they had no choice, but also because endurance itself became an act of defiance. Each day of survival was a victory against despair, a refusal to yield to the enemy at the gates. The city, though battered, refused to collapse, and that refusal was Moscow's greatest weapon. Moscow's darkest hour was also its hour of greatest resolve. The evacuation of government offices, the panic in the streets, and the endless rumors of collapse all pointed to defeat. Yet Stalin's decision to stay, and his defiant speech on November 7th, turned panic into defiance. The city became a living fortress, held together not just by walls and trenches, but by the unyielding spirit of its people. German forces believed they were advancing into a dying capital. Instead, they faced a city reborn through struggle, its heart beating stronger under fire. Moscow had stared into the abyss and refused to fall. The red banner still flew over the Kremlin, and in that banner lay the promise that the Soviet Union would endure. The darkest hour had passed, but the battle for Moscow was far from over. By late November 1941, the Wehrmacht had clawed its way through mud, snow, and bitter Soviet resistance to the very threshold of Moscow. German troops advancing along the Leningrad highway reached the town of Krasnaya Polyana, only 20 miles from the Kremlin's spires. Here, for the first time, forward patrols reported that they could see the silhouette of Moscow itself shimmering on the horizon. To exhausted soldiers, it was both a triumph and a torment, the goal of their campaign visible, yet still out of reach. Krasnaya Polyana became a battlefield of ferocious intensity, with German tanks rumbling through its outskirts, while Soviet defenders fought from houses, cellars, and barns. Villages nearby were reduced to ashes by artillery, their wooden huts set ablaze in the bitter cold. Every step forward was paid for in blood, each field contested by Red Army troops who refused to yield. Yet the Germans pressed on, convinced they were at the cusp of final victory. In the frozen air, Moscow's shadow loomed larger with every mile. Northwest of the city, German reconnaissance units pushed into Khimki, barely 10 miles from the Kremlin's center. Patrols reached the Moscow-Volga Canal, a final natural barrier protecting the capital. and reported glimpses of Moscow's outskirts through the winter haze. Soldiers scribbled letters home, claiming they had seen the golden domes of the Kremlin, the towers rising above the snow. For a moment the illusion of victory seemed tangible, as though the city itself could be grasped by stretched hands. Yet these patrols were thin and vulnerable, probing into territory fiercely defended by Soviet units. Counterattacks struck with sudden ferocity, driving the Germans back from Khimki and restoring the line. Still, the psychological impact of reaching so close was immense, both for Germans who thought the war was won, and Soviets who realized how narrow the margin of survival had become. The suburbs of Moscow had become the very edge of destiny, and both sides knew it. South of the capital, the Germans pressed toward Kashira and other towns along the Oka River. Here, Guderian's armored spearheads sought to envelop Moscow from below, a maneuver that promised to cut the capital off from reinforcements. Soviet defenders, reinforced by hastily assembled militia and Siberian divisions, met them with ferocious resistance. Bridges were blown as soon as German tanks approached, forcing engineers to build makeshift crossings under fire. Villages became fortresses, defended by women, old men, and schoolchildren alongside soldiers. In Kashira, defenders fought street by street, turning every alley into a killing ground. German advances slowed to a crawl, their tanks immobilized by snowdrifts and relentless Soviet counterattacks. The southern pincer, meant to strangle Moscow, faltered under the weight of resistance. The city was not surrounded, and its southern flank held strong. For German soldiers, the proximity of Moscow was surreal. After 5 months of brutal campaigning, they believed they had reached the culmination of their mission. Patrols sent back photographs of road signs pointing to Moscow, symbols of triumph to be shared with the Reich. Some soldiers claimed they could hear the bells of the Kremlin when the wind was right, though it was more dream than reality. The propaganda machine seized upon these stories, boasting that German troops stood within sight of their prize. Soldiers huddled in snowbound trenches whispered that the next assault would carry them into the capital itself. Yet day after day the city remained elusive, its defences bristling with fresh troops and barricades. What looked so close on the map proved impossibly far in reality. Moscow, shimmering on the horizon, was a mirage of victory, and that mirage would vanish in the storm of winter. The fighting in the suburbs revealed the full desperation of the Soviet defense. Trenches ringed the outskirts, dug by civilians who refused to abandon their city. Barricades of logs, sandbags, and overturned trams blocked the streets, manned by hastily armed workers' militias. Anti-tank ditches stretched across frozen fields, forcing German armor into narrow kill zones where artillery waited. Soviet snipers haunted ruined buildings, picking off officers with patient precision. Civilians fought with Molotov cocktails, setting German vehicles ablaze in bursts of flame against the snow. Women carried ammunition to the front, while children filled sandbags and distributed tea to shivering soldiers. The entire city had become a living organism of resistance, every street an artery feeding the fight. German troops expected a swift collapse. Instead, they met defiance at every corner. The suburbs of Moscow became a battlefield unlike any they had faced before, and the city refused to yield. Winter deepened, and with it the suffering of the German army grew unbearable. Vehicles froze solid in the snow, their engines useless against the bitter cold. Soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets and captured Soviet coats, still shivering in temperatures that plunged below -30 degrees. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, leaving men incapacitated without a shot fired. Ammunition was rationed, and food became scarce, with soldiers gnawing on frozen bread as their only sustenance. In the suburbs, dugouts filled with snow and ice, offering little protection from the elements. Meanwhile, Soviet defenders were better equipped, supplied with winter clothing, and supported by civilians who knew how to endure the cold. The contrast was stark, one army freezing, the other hardening. The Germans had reached the edge of their endurance, and the gates of Moscow remained closed. For the Soviet leadership, the sight of German troops so close to Moscow was terrifying but galvanizing. Stalin and Zhukov poured reinforcements into the city, reorganizing divisions battered from previous battles. Siberian troops, trained and equipped for winter, were rushed to the front, their arrival kept secret until the moment of attack. Civilians continued their relentless work, fortifying streets and constructing bunkers in anticipation of a final assault. The Soviet capital was prepared to fight house by house, street by street, if necessary. Stalin's speeches echoed through the city, reminding Muscovites of their historical duty to defend the motherland. The Red Army, despite staggering losses, found new reserves of strength in the shadow of the Kremlin. Each counterattack in the suburbs proved that the Germans could be stopped, even at the very edge of victory. Moscow's survival became more than a military objective, it was the soul of Russia itself, and that soul refused to die. The battles at Krasnaya Polyana, Khimki, and the southern approaches marked the high water mark of the German invasion. Patrols had glimpsed Moscow's spires, the closest the Wehrmacht would ever come to the Soviet capital. But they would come no closer. Exhaustion, weather, and relentless Soviet resistance had bled the German advance dry. The dream of storming Moscow had turned into a nightmare of attrition, fought in snow, ice, and endless sacrifice. For the Soviets, survival in those desperate weeks became their greatest victory, proving that even at its weakest, the Red Army could endure. The suburbs became scars of defiance, their ruins testifying to the price of resistance. The German army had reached the very edge of triumph, but history would record that the gates of Moscow remained shut, and from those gates, the tide of war would soon begin to turn. As Moscow braced itself for collapse in November 1941, salvation was being prepared thousands of miles away. In Tokyo, the German ambassador and Japanese officials speculated about whether Japan would strike the Soviet Union from the east. Stalin could not gamble. As long as the threat of a Japanese attack loomed, he dared not strip his far eastern frontier of troops. The decision hung on a single thread of intelligence, and that thread was held by Richard Sorge, the Soviet spy embedded in Tokyo. Sorge, disguised as a German journalist, had infiltrated the highest circles of German and Japanese leadership. His report, sent back to Moscow, carried the critical message that Japan had no intention of attacking Siberia in 1941. Instead, Japan looked southward, toward the colonies of Britain and the United States. With that assurance, Stalin knew his eastern frontier was secure, and the divisions guarding it could be sent west, toward the desperate defense of Moscow. The redeployment of Siberian divisions was a logistical feat as immense as it was urgent. Special trains carried thousands of troops across the breadth of Russia, steaming day and night through forests, mountains, and frozen plains. Soldiers rode in unheated carriages, their breath condensing into frost on the windows, their spirits hardened by the cold. Alongside them traveled tanks, artillery, and supplies, each train car a piece of Moscow's salvation. Entire divisions shifted westward, their movements cloaked in secrecy to avoid German detection. At every stop, civilians offered food and gifts, aware that these men were traveling to defend the capital. The journey itself became a rallying cry as rumors spread that the Siberians are coming. For Moscow, shivering under siege, the promise of fresh reinforcements became a beacon of hope. The trains rolled westward like veins pumping lifeblood into a faltering heart, and at the end of the line waited the gates of Moscow. The Siberian divisions were no ordinary troops. They were veterans of the far eastern frontier, trained to fight in some of the harshest conditions on earth. These men knew how to march through snow, how to camouflage themselves in white uniforms, and how to endure sub-zero temperatures without collapse. Their equipment reflected this expertise: fur-lined coats, felt boots, mittens, and padded uniforms that shielded them from the cold. Unlike the Germans, who shivered in thin summer tunics, the Siberians moved with confidence in the Russian winter. They brought with them T-34 and KV-1 tanks, machines whose engines and armor performed better in the freezing conditions than their German counterparts. Their artillery, pulled by hardy horses, arrived ready to fight in terrain that immobilized mechanized units. Most importantly, their morale was unbroken, their discipline ironclad. They were not arriving to collapse, they were arriving to strike, and their presence changed the balance of power. Zhukov, entrusted with Moscow's defense, integrated the Siberians into his battered front with precision. He positioned them at critical sectors, where German breakthroughs threatened to open the road to the capital. At Klin, they reinforced exhausted divisions holding the northern approaches. At Tula, they stiffened the southern flank, preventing Guderian's panzers from encircling Moscow. In the center, near the Moscow-Volga Canal, their arrival allowed for counterattacks that surprised the advancing Germans. The effect was immediate and profound. Where before Soviet lines wavered, they now held firm. German soldiers, already demoralized by frostbite and supply shortages, were stunned to face fresh, well-equipped troops. Reports described Siberian infantry charging through snowstorms, their white uniforms rendering them ghosts in the winter landscape. For the first time, the initiative began to slip from German hands, and Zhukov sensed that the tide was about to turn. The psychological impact of the Siberians' arrival was as great as their military contribution. For Soviet soldiers who had endured months of retreat, their presence signaled that reinforcements were not a myth but reality. Rumors spread like wildfire. These were men who could fight in -40 degrees, men who feared neither frost nor the enemy. Civilians in Moscow spoke of them in reverent tones, calling them the Army of the Snow. The morale of the entire capital lifted, transforming despair into renewed determination. German prisoners captured at the front admitted their shock at encountering fresh divisions, believing the Red Army had already been destroyed. Propaganda on both sides seized the narrative for the Soviets. The Siberians were saviors; for the Germans, they were harbingers of defeat. The clash of perception mirrored the clash of armies, and both foretold a new chapter in the battle for Moscow. The Germans, meanwhile, underestimated the significance of these reinforcements. Hitler dismissed the reports as exaggerations, convinced the Soviets had no reserves left to deploy. His generals, however, saw the truth on the battlefield. Divisions that had been stretched thin now faced sudden counterattacks, spearheaded by troops in white uniforms advancing through blizzards. Machine guns rattled as Siberians charged across frozen fields, their discipline and training evident in every step. German officers noted with alarm that the Soviets no longer fought merely to hold ground, they now fought to reclaim it. The fragile aura of German invincibility began to crack. Siberian bayonets glittered in the snow, a promise that Moscow would not fall. And with each clash, the Wehrmacht's dream of victory slipped further away. The scale of the redeployment was staggering. Historians estimate that between 20 and 30 Siberian divisions, along with hundreds of tanks and aircraft, were transferred to Moscow's defense. It was an army in itself, arriving at the moment of greatest peril. Their presence allowed Zhukov to launch limited counteroffensives in late November, striking German units reeling from cold and exhaustion. Skirmishes that had once been defensive in nature now carried an offensive edge, pushing German troops back from key positions. The Siberians' confidence proved infectious, spreading through the ranks of the Red Army like fire through dry timber. Soldiers who had once expected only to die in Moscow now believed they might drive the invader away. The transformation was profound, and it marked the beginning of the Red Army's resurgence. The arrival of the Siberian Reinforcements was more than a tactical shift. It was a turning point in history. Intelligence from Richard Sorge had unlocked the reserves that saved the Soviet Union. The trains that carried those divisions across thousands of miles carried also the fate of the Eastern Front. When they stepped into the snow outside Moscow, they brought with them the promise of survival and the power to strike back. For the Germans, it was the beginning of the end of their advance, the moment when winter and resistance combined against them. For the Soviets, it was the dawn of a counteroffensive that would change the course of the war. The Siberians had come not to defend, but to drive the enemy from the gates of Moscow, and in their hands lay the future of the Soviet capital. From the east came salvation, and with it the rebirth of hope. By December 1941, the thunder of Operation Typhoon had faded into a weary grind of survival. The German divisions that had once stormed across the steppe now stood frozen, their momentum drained by weather, exhaustion, and resistance. Soldiers who had believed victory was within sight now shivered in snow-filled trenches, their rifles stiff with ice. Tanks, once the cutting edge of blitzkrieg, stood immobile in fields of white, their engines cracked by the cold. Ammunition stocks dwindled, forcing commanders to ration shells and limit artillery fire to only the most desperate moments. Fuel shortages immobilized entire panzer regiments, reducing them from armored spearheads to static defenses. Infantrymen scavenged for firewood and food, their uniforms inadequate for the bitter Russian winter. Horses died by the thousands, leaving artillery stranded in the snowdrifts. The drive on Moscow, conceived as a lightning strike, had slowed to a crawl, and the German war machine stood paralyzed in the ice. The supply system, already strained by months of campaigning, collapsed under the weight of distance and weather. Railways, the arteries of German logistics, ended hundreds of miles behind the front. Every shell, ration, and drop of fuel had to be trucked along roads buried in snow or torn apart by mud. Convoys broke down daily, their vehicles abandoned by the roadside as mechanics lacked the tools or parts for repairs. Soviet partisans struck with increasing boldness, ambushing supply columns and blowing up bridges under cover of darkness. Fuel shortages grew so dire that German officers were ordered to prioritize tanks over trucks, leaving infantry undersupplied. Soldiers boiled snow for water and slaughtered their last horses for food. Winter clothing, promised but never delivered, left men wrapping rags around their feet to stave off frostbite. What had been designed as a swift offensive now demanded an impossible logistical miracle, and no miracle came. German commanders, hardened by previous campaigns, now faced challenges beyond their experience. The doctrine of blitzkrieg had thrived on mobility, speed, and surprise, but in the forests and fields before Moscow, speed had evaporated, surprise was gone, and mobility was buried under snow. Von Bock urged Hitler to authorize a pause, recognizing that his armies could not sustain further assaults. Yet Hitler, driven by obsession, demanded Moscow's capture regardless of the cost. This clash of reality and ideology deepened the strain at every level of command. Division commanders wrote grim reports of units reduced to a fraction of their strength, their men collapsing from exhaustion, Junior officers struggled to enforce discipline as morale eroded with each frostbitten casualty. Soldiers muttered of Napoleon's fate, comparing their plight to the frozen march of the Grande Armée in 1812. For the first time, doubt crept openly into the ranks of the Wehrmacht, and doubt was a weapon the Soviets could exploit. The Soviet defense, though battered, had transformed into a wall of iron. Siberian reinforcements poured into the front lines, their white-clad ranks blending into the snow as they launched counterattacks. Soviet artillery, once scarce, now thundered with renewed strength, supplied by factories relocated east of the Urals. The Red Army had learned hard lessons from months of defeat, adapting tactics to exploit German weaknesses. They targeted fuel depots, supply columns, and isolated strongpoints, leaving German spearheads stranded without support. In Moscow, civilians continued to dig trenches and build barricades, ensuring that if the Germans broke through, every street would become a battlefield. Soviet propaganda trumpeted the resilience of the capital, lifting morale even as bombs fell nightly. Commanders like Zhukov coordinated the defense with ruthless efficiency, using reserves to plug gaps at critical moments. What had seemed like a collapsing army in October now stood firm in December, and the Germans found themselves slamming against a wall they could not break. On the battlefield, the disparity between attacker and defender grew increasingly stark. German soldiers, frostbitten and hungry, launched assaults with dwindling ammunition and failing equipment. Soviet troops, better supplied for winter, counterattacked with rifles, tanks, and skis, moving fluidly through snowfields the Germans could barely cross. At Klin and Tula, German offensives sputtered into stalemate, their once mighty momentum reduced to skirmishes over frozen villages. Luftwaffe sorties dwindled as planes froze on airfields or lacked sufficient fuel to fly. Soviet aircraft, by contrast, grew bolder, striking airfields and convoys that had once been untouchable. German wounded lay in overcrowded field hospitals, where doctors amputated frostbitten limbs with crude tools and minimal anesthesia. The gap between the Wehrmacht confidence and its reality widened into a chasm. Soldiers who once dreamed of victory now prayed only for survival, and survival was slipping further from reach with every passing day. The morale of German troops sank into despair as December deepened. Men huddled around feeble fires, their uniforms stiff with ice, their bodies gnawed by hunger. Letters home spoke not of triumph but of misery, describing comrades frozen in trenches, their rifles clutched in lifeless hands. Commanders feared not only Soviet attacks, but the creeping collapse of discipline within their ranks. Soldiers deserted or refused orders, preferring captivity to freezing death in the snow. Frostbite and sickness claimed more casualties than Soviet bullets, reducing divisions to skeletal strength. Entire units were withdrawn, not because of combat losses, but because their men were physically incapable of fighting. The myth of invincibility, nurtured through campaigns in Poland and France, dissolved in the Russian winter. What remained was an army hollowed out by exhaustion and despair. Operation Typhoon was no longer a storm. It was a whisper in the snow. For the Soviets, the stalling of Operation Typhoon was more than survival. It was vindication. Stalin, who had gambled by holding Moscow, now saw his defiance rewarded. The Red Army, once reeling from encirclements, now stood on the cusp of counterattack. Civilians who had endured panic and evacuation found renewed courage in the knowledge that the Germans had been stopped. Propaganda proclaimed that the invincible Wehrmacht had met its match before Moscow. Soldiers in the trenches whispered with pride that they had outlasted the enemy who once seemed unstoppable. Factories in the Urals churned out new weapons, each rifle and shell a promise that the fight would continue. The tide of history, imperceptible in the moment, was beginning to shift, and the snow that blanketed Moscow became the shroud of German ambition. Operation Typhoon had begun as Hitler's bold bid to end the war in the east with a single blow. It ended as a frozen stalemate, with German armies immobilized before the gates of Moscow. Exhaustion, shortages, and Soviet resilience had combined to break the momentum of blitzkrieg. The Germans had advanced farther than Napoleon's army, but like Napoleon, they found that Moscow was a city too far. The dream of conquest evaporated in the frost, leaving only the grim reality of attrition. Soldiers who had once expected parades in Red Square now faced endless snow, endless hunger, and endless resistance. For the first time since 1939, the Wehrmacht had failed to achieve its objective. Operation Typhoon had not delivered victory. Instead, it delivered the first crack in Hitler's war machine, and through that crack, the Soviet Union prepared to strike back. On December 5, 1941, as snow blanketed the fields around Moscow, Georgy Zhukov unleashed the counterstroke that Stalin had demanded. For months, the Red Army had absorbed the hammer blows of Operation Typhoon, clinging to the city by the narrowest margins. Now, with fresh divisions from Siberia, reserves reorganized, and German forces exhausted, the time had come to strike. At dawn, Soviet artillery shattered the silence, unleashing a barrage that rolled like thunder across the frozen landscape. Shells screamed overhead, smashing into German positions, already weakened by hunger and frost. Behind the guns, Soviet infantry surged forward, white-clad figures advancing through snowdrifts like ghosts of winter. T-34 tanks rumbled into action, their engines roaring defiantly against the cold that had crippled German machines. The Germans, unprepared for a counterattack, staggered under the onslaught. For the first time since June, the initiative belonged to the Red Army, and the battlefield began to tilt. The Siberian division spearheaded the assault with precision born of experience. These men were trained for winter war, their movements sure and practiced in the deep snow. Clad in white camouflage, they advanced invisibly across open fields, appearing only when the muzzle flash of rifles gave them away. Ski battalions glided swiftly over drifts, bypassing German strongpoints and striking at flanks with sudden violence. T-34, their wide tracks spreading weight evenly, crushed through snow where German panzers bogged down. Soviet artillery pounded roads and villages, severing the fragile German supply lines that had held their advance together. Cavalry units reappeared on the battlefield, charging through forests and striking behind enemy lines in a style both ancient and modern. German soldiers, huddled in frozen trenches, were stunned by the ferocity and speed of the Soviet assault. The hunter had become the hunted, and Moscow's defenders were now Moscow's avengers. Zhukov's plan was ambitious but calculated. Rather than a single blow, the counteroffensive struck across a vast front, stretching from Kalinin in the north to Tula in the south. At Kalinin, Soviet forces attacked the exposed flank of Army Group Center, forcing the Germans into retreat. At Kalinin, Siberian divisions pushed the enemy from the very suburbs of Moscow, recapturing ground the Wehrmacht had nearly secured. South of the capital, counterattacks at Tula crushed Guderian's southern pincer, breaking the dream of encirclement once and for all. Everywhere the Germans fell back, their formations unraveling as Soviet pressure mounted. Zhukov's coordination was relentless, shifting reserves to exploit every crack in the German line. For the first time, the Red Army moved not defensively, but offensively, with confidence in its strength. The Soviets were not merely holding Moscow, they were pushing the enemy away. For German troops, the counteroffensive was a nightmare realized. Exhausted, frostbitten, and undersupplied, they were suddenly forced into retreat by an enemy they believed beaten. Divisions already reduced to half strength crumbled under fresh assaults, their survivors fleeing through snow-choked forests. Officers struggled to maintain discipline, but the chaos of retreat often overwhelmed command. Panzers abandoned in frozen fields became monuments to the failure of blitzkrieg in Russia. Horses collapsed in the snow, their carcasses lining the roads as columns struggled eastward. Soldiers wrapped in blankets and captured Soviet coats stumbled back, pursued by relentless counterattacks. German propaganda, once confident of Moscow's fall, now spoke only of regrouping. The Wehrmacht, for the first time in the war, had been driven back in a major theater, and the retreat left scars that would never heal. The Soviets pressed their advantage with ferocity. At Klin, counterattacks cut through German lines, forcing entire divisions to abandon their positions. At Kaluga, the Red Army pushed southward, reclaiming towns that had flown the swastika only days before. In the forests near Volokholemsk, Soviet ski battalions harassed retreating columns, cutting them off from supply and forcing desperate fights in the snow. Soviet artillery pounded retreating units, turning frozen roads into graveyards of men and machines. T-34 Sib-headed breakthroughs, often advancing through waist-deep snow where German tanks could not follow. Cavalry raids slashed deep behind the lines, sowing terror among the retreating Wehrmacht. Villages once under German occupation were liberated, their inhabitants emerging from cellars and forests to greet Soviet troops with tears and bread. The tide of war had shifted, if only slightly, and it was visible in the joy of those freed. The retreat of the Wehrmacht was now undeniable. For Moscow, the counteroffensive was salvation made flesh. Civilians who had prepared for the city's fall now witnessed German retreat, their despair replaced by hope. Factories roared with renewed vigor, their workers inspired by the news of Soviet advances. Newspapers printed headlines of victory, and radios broadcast triumphant reports of the Red Army's resurgence. Stalin, who had risked everything by staying in Moscow, now basked in vindication. The November parade, once mocked as spectacle, now stood as prophecy fulfilled. Soldiers marched not into oblivion, but into triumph, reclaiming the frozen fields they had once abandoned. The capital, battered but unbroken, breathed again, and the Soviet people understood that Moscow had not merely survived, it had endured to strike back. The scale of the German retreat shocked even their own commanders. Army Group Center, the spearhead of Hitler's grand design, fell back between 60 and 150 miles across the front. Towns that had been staging grounds for the assault on Moscow became scenes of desperate withdrawal. Hitler, enraged, forbade retreat, but reality on the ground made obedience impossible. Generals disobeyed or concealed withdrawals, saving their men from destruction, but risking the Führer's wrath. For the first time, the myth of Hitler's infallibility cracked within the officer corps. Soldiers who had once believed victory was assured, now spoke of survival and endurance. The Soviet counteroffensive had not destroyed the Wehrmacht, but it had broken its aura of invincibility. The road to Moscow no longer led forward, it led backward through snow, ice, and failure. The Soviet counteroffensive of December 1941 marked the first great defeat of Hitler's armies in the Second World War. What began as a desperate defense transformed into a stunning reversal, driving the Germans from the gates of Moscow. The Siberians, the artillery, the tanks, and above all the will of the Soviet people had combined into a force the invaders could not withstand. The Wehrmacht, once masters of the continent, found themselves humbled in the Russian winter. The dream of parading through Red Square had dissolved into the nightmare of retreat. For the Soviets, It was proof that victory was possible, that the German giant could bleed and stumble. For the world, it was a signal that Hitler's war could be stopped. The battle for Moscow was not the end of the war, but it was the end of illusion, and from that December snow, the course of history began to change. As the Soviet counteroffensive thundered across the front in December 1941, the mighty Army Group Center began a retreat it had never planned for. Columns of German soldiers trudged westward through waist-deep snow, their once proud formations reduced to shadows of themselves. Tanks were abandoned in ditches, their engines frozen solid, while artillery pieces stood silent, their crews too exhausted to haul them away. Roads clogged with wagons, trucks, and troops stretched for miles, each step marked by the frozen corpses of men and animals. The retreat was not orderly maneuver, but desperate flight, as divisions sought to avoid encirclement by relentless Soviet thrusts. Villages once proclaimed as staging grounds for the conquest of Moscow were now defended only long enough to cover withdrawal. German soldiers, frostbitten and starving, stumbled back with hollow eyes, carrying wounded comrades on sleds fashioned from doors. This was not the blitzkrieg that had swept across Europe. This was survival against a storm of iron and snow, and it was the first sign of true defeat. The shock reverberated all the way to Berlin. Hitler had promised his people a swift victory, boasting that Moscow would fall before winter and that the Soviet Union would collapse soon after. Now, reports of retreat and collapse poured into the Reich Chancellery, shattering the illusion of inevitability. Propaganda struggled to conceal the truth, speaking of shortened lines and strategic withdrawals, but soldiers' letters home told a different story. Families who had believed their sons were marching toward triumph now learned they were freezing in the forests outside Moscow. German generals, once confident in Hitler's genius, began to question his judgment. The Führer's insistence on holding ground at all costs clashed with the reality of survival on the front. The myth of invincibility, carefully crafted through victories in Poland, France, and the Balkans, cracked beneath the snows of Russia, and in that crack fear entered the German war machine. The Reich had suffered its first undeniable setback. Among the Axis allies, the retreat sowed deep unease. Italy, already struggling in North Africa and the Balkans, now watched with dread as Germany faltered on the Eastern Front. Hungary and Romania, who had sent troops into Russia alongside the Wehrmacht, faced the bitter reality that their men were dying in battles that no longer promised victory. Finland, fighting its own war against the Soviets in the north, reconsidered the extent of its cooperation with Berlin. Even Japan, an Axis partner, drew lessons from the German failure, calculating that an attack on Siberia would yield disaster. The aura of German supremacy, which had held the alliance together, began to erode. Allies who had once believed Germany unbeatable now questioned whether Hitler's gamble in the East had doomed them all. The retreat from Moscow was not merely a German problem. It was a tremor that shook the entire Axis coalition, and the tremors would only grow stronger. For the German soldiers at the front, defeat was not abstract. It was carved into their flesh and bone. Frostbite turned hands black, forcing amputations in field hospitals overwhelmed by casualties. Starving men gnawed on frozen bread or horseflesh, their rations long since consumed. Boots disintegrated in the cold, leaving soldiers to wrap their feet in rags scavenged from villages. The wounded rode in open wagons, their cries muffled by blankets as snow buried them on the march. Officers struggled to maintain order, but morale crumbled with each day of retreat. Soldiers whispered bitterly of Napoleon, whose army had also reached Moscow only to be destroyed by winter and resistance. They cursed their leaders, cursed the endless snow, and cursed a war that no longer seemed winnable. For many, the hope of victory was gone. All that remained was survival. and survival was slipping away with every step backward. The Soviets pressed their advantage with ferocity, determined to exploit the German retreat. Ski battalions darted through forests, cutting off columns and striking supply lines with precision. Cavalry divisions, seemingly an anachronism, reappeared as mobile forces, harassing rear guards and overrunning isolated units. T-34 sprawled the snow-covered fields, their engines suited to the cold, forcing the Germans to abandon more ground. Soviet artillery shelled crossroads and bridges, turning every retreat into a gauntlet of fire. Villages liberated by Red Army troops became symbols of defiance, their people cheering through tears as they greeted their saviors. The Germans, who had once dictated the pace of war, now found themselves reacting, fleeing, and bleeding. Each mile lost was a mile reclaimed by the Soviet Union, a reversal unthinkable only months before. The Red Army had turned from hunted to hunter, and it chased the Wehrmacht west with relentless determination. For the German High Command, the retreat marked a catastrophic failure of strategy. Operation Barbarossa had been built on speed, surprise, and destruction of Soviet armies before winter. Instead, Moscow stood unbroken, and German divisions lay shattered in the snow. The retreat exposed the flaws of overextension, as supply lines stretched too far and reserves proved inadequate. Hitler's refusal to authorize timely withdrawals turned setbacks into disasters, costing thousands of lives. His generals, once obedient, began to conceal the true scale of losses, fearing his wrath. The aura of invincibility that had followed the Wehrmacht since 1939 was gone. Instead, the German army now faced a war of attrition it was ill-prepared to fight. The Soviet Union had endured the storm, and the storm had broken upon it. For the Soviets, the retreat of Army Group Center was more than a battlefield success. It was proof of survival. Moscow still stood, its spires untouched, its people unbroken. The Red Army, bloodied but unbowed, had delivered the first great blow against Hitler's empire. Propaganda celebrated the victory with fervor, proclaiming that the fascist beast had been driven from the gates of the capital. Civilians who had dug trenches, built barricades, and endured air raids now rejoiced in triumph. Stalin, vindicated in his decision to stay, claimed credit for the city's salvation. Yet the victory was not only his, it belonged to every soldier who froze in a trench, every worker who built a tank, every child who carried sandbags. Moscow's survival became a symbol of the Soviet will, and that will would now carry into the next battles. The retreat from Moscow was the first great defeat suffered by the Wehrmacht on land. Blitzkrieg, the lightning war that had conquered Europe in months, had been halted, blunted, and thrown back. The shock echoed across the world, proving that Hitler's armies were not invincible. For the Allies, it was a glimmer of hope, a sign that the war could still be won. For the Axis, it was a shadow of doubt that would deepen with each passing year. The Eastern Front, once envisioned as a swift campaign, had become a vast war of attrition, and in that war, time, distance, and resilience favored the Soviet Union. The snow before Moscow had swallowed the German dream of conquest. The tide of history had begun to turn, and the story of Nazi defeat had its first chapter written in the winter of 1941. The Battle of Moscow was more than a clash of armies. It was a collision of wills that reshaped the Second World War. When the snow settled in early 1942, the Wehrmacht stood bloodied, forced back from the gates of a city it had sworn to capture. Hitler's vision of a lightning war, of a Soviet Union crushed in a single campaign, lay shattered in the frozen fields around the capital. Strategically, the survival of Moscow preserved the Soviet Union's command. its transportation hub, and its heart of industry. The city's railways, linking north, south, and east, remained in Soviet hands, ensuring the Red Army could shift men and supplies across the vast front. Moscow's factories, though battered, continued to produce weapons, feeding the armies that would later strike back across Europe. Had Moscow fallen, the entire Soviet system might have collapsed, but it did not fall, and in its survival lay the seeds of Hitler's ultimate defeat. The psychological impact of the victory was immense, reverberating far beyond the Soviet Union. For the first time since 1939, the Wehrmacht had been decisively defeated on land, its aura of invincibility broken. Across the world, headlines proclaimed the miracle of Moscow, signaling to allies and occupied peoples alike that Hitler could be stopped. In London, Churchill hailed the defense as a turning point, while in Washington, Roosevelt took heart as America entered the war after Pearl Harbor. Resistance movements in Europe, long suppressed under Nazi rule, drew strength from the news of German failure. In Berlin, by contrast, the mood was grim, with propaganda unable to mask the truth of retreat. Families received letters filled with accounts of frostbite, starvation, and death, shattering illusions of inevitable victory. Even within the German officer corps, confidence in Hitler's strategy began to crack. The myth of the unstoppable blitzkrieg was gone, and with it, Nazi Germany's dream of easy conquest. For the Soviet people, Moscow's survival became a rallying cry for the entire war. Civilians who had dug trenches, worked in freezing factories, and endured bombing raids saw their sacrifices vindicated. Soldiers who had stood in the snow with little more than rifles and courage now knew that victory was possible. The November 7th parade on Red Square, once seen as a desperate gamble, became a symbol of unbreakable will. The city itself, scarred but unbowed, embodied the spirit of resistance that would carry the Soviet Union through 4 more years of war. Moscow was no longer just a capital. It was a fortress, a beacon, and a graveyard for German ambitions. Stalin seized the moment, proclaiming that the Red Army had proven itself equal to the finest armies of Europe. The defense of Moscow became a myth in its own right, woven into Soviet identity for generations. It was the moment the tide began to turn, and it would never turn back. The strategic consequences extended far beyond morale. By halting the Germans at Moscow, the Soviets bought critical time to relocate industries deep into the Urals and Siberia. Entire factories dismantled in Leningrad, Kharkov, and Kiev now roared to life in distant cities like Magnitogorsk, Chelyabinsk, and Sverdlovsk. There, safe from Luftwaffe raids, they produced the tanks, planes, and artillery that would eventually overwhelm the Wehrmacht. The Soviet command structure, preserved in Moscow, could now coordinate a war effort on a scale Hitler had never anticipated. The survival of the capital also secured vital transportation networks, ensuring reinforcements and supplies could continue flowing across the vast Soviet front. Each of these factors compounded over time, turning the Soviet Union from a nation on the brink of collapse into an industrial giant of war. The winter of 1941 was not just about survival, it was the foundation for eventual triumph. For Hitler, the failure before Moscow was both humiliating and corrosive. He had promised his people victory, only to deliver retreat and disaster. His rage turned inward, blaming his generals for the setbacks and tightening his grip over military decisions. This loss marked the beginning of his distrust in professional commanders, setting the stage for future strategic blunders. The Wehrmacht, once a disciplined instrument of military genius, became shackled by Hitler's increasingly erratic orders. Among the German rank and file, confidence waned, replaced by fear of endless winters and an enemy that refused to die. The comparison to Napoleon, whispered in frozen trenches, became unavoidable. Moscow had not only resisted, it had cursed invaders as it had a century earlier. For Hitler, the failure planted seeds of paranoia, and those seeds would bear poisonous fruit in campaigns yet to come. Among the Allies, the defense of Moscow was hailed as a turning point in the global war. Britain, still reeling from the Blitz and setbacks in North Africa, found in Moscow survival proof that Hitler could be contained. The United States, now entering the conflict, viewed the Soviet stand as assurance that their new ally was capable of resisting German might. Across Asia, where Japan expanded its empire, the German failure tempered Japanese ambitions against the Soviet Union. Instead, Tokyo turned its gaze southward, leaving Siberia secure for the Soviets to draw upon in their defense. Moscow thus shaped not only the Eastern Front, but the global balance of the war. It bound together the uneasy alliance of Britain, America, and the Soviet Union, and it gave hope to a world drowning under fascist conquest. For the German people, the retreat from Moscow was the first painful lesson in the reality of total war. Families who had cheered parades in Berlin now buried sons lost in the Russian snow. Communities that had once celebrated swift victories now whispered anxiously about a war without end. Propaganda continued to promise ultimate triumph, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Letters from the front described not glory but hunger, frostbite, and endless retreat. The dream of a quick war had evaporated, replaced by the nightmare of attrition. This psychological shift within the Reich was as significant as the military defeat itself. The German people now understood that the war in the East would not be swift nor certain, and that realization would haunt them as the Red Army grew stronger. The Battle of Moscow was not the end of the war, but it was the end of Hitler's illusions. The Wehrmacht, which had swept across Europe in an unstoppable tide, had been broken before the gates of the Soviet capital. Strategically, it ensured the Soviet Union's survival, allowing it to rebuild and prepare for the titanic struggles to come. Psychologically, it proved to the world that Nazi Germany could be beaten, that resistance was not futile. For the Soviets, it became a symbol of resilience, the moment when despair turned to defiance, and defiance to hope. For the Germans, it was the first taste of defeat, the beginning of a long and bloody road that would end in Berlin. Moscow was not just a city defended. It was a promise written in snow and blood that Hitler's empire would one day fall. The graveyard of German ambitions lay in the Russian winter, and from that graveyard, the road to victory began.